Picture this: a knight clad in the iconic white mantle, marked with a bold red cross. But instead of standing guard at Jerusalem's gates, he's navigating the bustling spice markets of India, or charting unknown coastlines under unfamiliar stars, or negotiating in whispered tones within the court of a Mongol Khan. We often think of the Knights Templar as defenders of the Holy Land, as warriors locked in eternal conflict on the arid battlefields of the Middle East, but that's only a fraction of their story. What if I told you their greatest adventures, their most daring and world-changing endeavors, took place far from the walls of Acre or Jerusalem? What if their true legacy lies not in the castles they held, but in the boundaries they crossed and the connections they forged between civilizations that, until then, had existed worlds apart? For centuries, the full scope of the Templars' ambition has remained hidden, overshadowed by myth, conspiracy, and an enduring focus on their European exploits. But today, we pull back the curtain on history's best-kept secret. The Knights Templar were not just warriors or bankers. They were explorers, diplomats, spies, and pioneers of globalization, operating on a scale that would not be matched for hundreds of years. From the golden libraries of Timbuktu to the misty highlands of Ethiopia, from the icy fjords of Greenland to the monsoon-swept coasts of India, these men in white mantles ventured into the unknown, driven by faith, curiosity, and an unyielding desire to expand their order's influence. They didn't just witness history, they shaped it in ways so profound that our world today would look different without their hidden hand. In this video, we're setting out on a journey to uncover 25 of their most astonishing, forgotten missions beyond Europe. Expeditions that redefined trade, rewrote maps, sparked cultural revolutions, and quietly redirected the flow of history itself. This isn't just a list, it's an excavation of lost stories, a recovery of moments when one group of determined individuals reached across continents and cultures, leaving marks that have lingered, often unseen, for centuries. So settle in and open your mind to possibilities you may never have imagined, because by the end of this exploration, you won't see the medieval world or the Knights Templar the same way again. To truly grasp the scale of these forgotten missions, we must first shatter the image of the Knights Templar as merely holy warriors trapped in a single, sacred theater of war. The reality is far more fascinating. This was an organization that operated on a truly global scale for its time, a kind of medieval multinational corporation with its own army, its own navy, its own intelligence service, and its own sprawling economic network. While the famous red cross on a white mantle symbolized their religious vows, it also became a recognizable brand, a badge of trust, power, and connectivity from the markets of London to the distant ports of the Red Sea. Their initial sacred duty was to protect pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem, but that role rapidly expanded. They became the bankers for kings and popes, the trusted guardians of vast estates, and the masters of a logistical web that stretched across the known world. This incredible infrastructure was the launchpad for their most daring expeditions. Scattered across Europe and the Holy Land were thousands of properties known as commanderies. These were not just monasteries or forts, but self-sufficient agricultural hubs, training grounds, and economic powerhouses that generated immense wealth. This revenue didn't just fund local charities. It financed massive building projects, advanced naval technology, and most importantly for our story, long-range missions of exploration and diplomacy. The Templars built and maintained their own fleet of ships, a crucial advantage that allowed them to move men, money, and messages across the Mediterranean with a speed and security that kings could only envy. But perhaps their most underappreciated asset was their diplomatic flexibility. They were masterful pragmatists. While sworn to defend Christendom, they routinely and successfully negotiated with Muslim sultans, Mongol khans, and other non-Christian rulers. They understood that power, trade, and survival often required building bridges rather than burning them. This complex network of commanderies, ships, and diplomatic channels transformed the order from a regional defensive force into a truly transnational entity with vested interests and active operations far beyond the borders of Europe. Their out-of-continent missions were never just romantic side quests or isolated adventures. Each one was a calculated, strategic endeavor designed to secure a critical resource, forge a vital alliance, or uncover game-changing knowledge. They were searching for new allies like the mythical Prester John. They were scouting new trade routes to break monopolies held by their rivals, and they were gathering intelligence on emerging global powers that could either threaten or aid their cause. They were, in essence, early pioneers of global strategy, thinking in terms of continents and oceans at a time when most lords were still squabbling over a single valley. This expansive, outward-looking mindset is the essential backdrop for everything that follows. It's the key that unlocks the true significance of their journeys into the unknown. Without understanding this vast operational capacity and global ambition, these 25 missions would seem like impossible fairy tales. But as we're about to see for the Knights Templar, they were just business as usual. And so it was with this sprawling network and global mindset that the Templars launched one of their most legendary and perilous quests, a mission born from a tantalizing mix of hope, rumor, and sheer strategic necessity. The story begins not on a battlefield, but in the echoing halls of European monasteries and the anxious courts of Crusader kings, all abuzz with a persistent and powerful legend. For decades, tales had circulated of a mighty Christian monarch ruling a kingdom of immense wealth and virtue somewhere far to the east, beyond the lands of Islam. This was Prester John, a priest-king who was said to command armies vast enough to crush the Muslim forces threatening the Holy Land from the rear. To the Templars, perpetually outnumbered and seeking any advantage, this was not merely a fable, it was a potential strategic lifeline. If such an ally existed, an alliance could change the entire balance of power in the Near East. And so, in the early 1200s, a small, dedicated team of Templar knights, likely chosen for their resilience, linguistic skills, and deep faith, received their orders. Their objective was as simple as it was daunting: travel into the unknown and find Prester John. Their journey was an epic of medieval exploration. Setting out from their strongholds in the Holy Land, they would have first had to navigate the complex political landscape of Ayyubid Egypt, perhaps disguising themselves as pilgrims or merchants to avoid detection. From there, the true challenge began: the brutal crossing of the Nubian desert and the ascent into the rugged highlands of Ethiopia, a realm as mysterious to Europeans as the surface of the moon. They faced scorching heat, sandstorms, unfamiliar diseases, and the constant threat of bandits or hostile local tribes. They were traveling blind, guided by fragmented maps, local rumors, and an unshakable belief in their divine purpose. Their arrival in the Ethiopian highlands would have been a moment of profound cultural shock and revelation. They did not find the mythical Prester John of European legend, but they did discover something arguably more valuable: the powerful and ancient Solomonic dynasty of Ethiopia, a proudly Christian kingdom that had been isolated from the rest of Christendom for centuries. Here was a real, tangible Christian power, not a myth. The initial contact must have been a delicate dance of diplomacy conducted through interpreters and gestures, with the Templars presenting themselves as emissaries from a distant branch of the Christian family. They found a sophisticated society with its own rich traditions of Orthodox Christianity, its own ancient churches carved from solid rock, and its own geopolitical concerns. The Templars, ever the pragmatists, quickly adapted their goals. While the dream of a massive encircling army faded, the opportunity for a strong alliance and, just as importantly, lucrative trade became immediately apparent. They began a fruitful exchange. The Templars offered European religious artifacts, insights into the wider world of Mediterranean politics, and perhaps most enticingly, advanced European military strategies and technologies. In return, the Ethiopians granted them access to something that made the entire perilous journey worthwhile: the legendary trade goods of Inner Africa. The Templars established a conduit for gold, ivory, exotic spices, and rare animal hides that began flowing back towards their ports on the Red Sea and onward to European markets. The impact of this first official mission was profound and far-reaching. It reforged a broken link in the chain of global Christianity, bringing Ethiopia back into the orbit of European awareness and establishing a diplomatic relationship that would endure for generations. For the Templar Order specifically, the mission was a resounding success on multiple levels. It demonstrated their capability to operate effectively over immense distances and across vast cultural divides. It provided a massive boost to their finances through control of new trade routes, wealth that would fund their operations for decades to come, and perhaps most significantly, it proved the immense value of their global, outward-looking strategy. They had ventured into the unknown based on a rumor and returned with a kingdom, forever altering the economic and political landscape of the medieval world. But while the Templars were forging new connections in the highlands of Africa, a storm of an entirely different nature was gathering on the eastern horizon, a force so immense and unprecedented that it would shake the very foundations of the medieval world. The Mongol Empire, under the successors of Genghis Khan, was exploding outward with a velocity and violence that Europe could scarcely comprehend. Cities were vanishing beneath the hooves of their cavalry, and rumors of an unstoppable, inhuman horde began to filter back to the west, sowing terror in royal courts and papal chambers alike. For the Knights Templar, with their vast intelligence network, this was not just a distant horror story. It was a direct and existential strategic puzzle. Were these Mongols simply mindless destroyers, or was there a method, a vulnerability, or even a potential alliance to be found within their ranks? The Order needed answers, and they needed them from the source. So, in the 1240s, a small, hand-picked team of Templar brothers, men chosen for their discretion, linguistic skills, and unwavering nerve, received perhaps the most dangerous assignment of their lives. They were to journey to the ends of the known earth, to the very heart of the Mongol Empire, and infiltrate the court of the Great Khan in his legendary capital of Karakoram. Their journey itself was a monumental feat of endurance, traveling thousands of miles across the vast, windswept steppes of Central Asia. These European knights would have encountered a world utterly alien to them. They moved along the same Silk Road routes they occasionally protected, but now as covert operatives deep behind enemy lines, surrounded by the cultural and military apparatus of the world's most powerful empire. Upon reaching Karakoram, their mission became a delicate and deadly balancing act. Officially, they were envoys, representatives of a distant power seeking to open diplomatic channels. But their true purpose was espionage, to observe, to learn, and to understand everything they could about this mysterious new superpower. They walked a tightrope, knowing that a single misstep, a single hint of their true intentions, could lead to a swift and brutal execution. What they documented in Karakorum was a revelation that would fundamentally reshape European understanding of the East. They saw that the Mongol war machine was not a faceless horde but a highly disciplined, brilliantly organized military force. The Templar spies took meticulous notes on their tactics, the use of feigned retreats to draw enemies into ambushes, the incredible coordination of their horse archers, and their sophisticated siege techniques for crushing fortified cities. But their intelligence went far beyond the battlefield. They provided the first detailed European reports on the Mongol administration, describing a complex system of governance, communication, and law that held the sprawling empire together. They documented the surprising religious tolerance practiced by the Khans, who entertained debates between Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and Taoists at court. This was a critical insight. It meant the Mongols were not inherently anti-Christian and could potentially be negotiated with. Most importantly, their reports began to debunk the myth of Mongol invincibility. They noted the internal rivalries between different khanates, the logistical challenges of supplying such a vast army, and the vulnerabilities that could be exploited by a well-prepared defender. This priceless intelligence did not simply gather dust in a Templar archive. When the Mongol invasion of Eastern Europe began in earnest, culminating in the devastating attacks on Poland and Hungary, the Templars' first-hand accounts became the bedrock of the European defensive strategy. Military commanders, armed with the knowledge provided by the order, began to adapt. They learned to avoid open field battles where the Mongol cavalry excelled, instead focusing on fortifying strongholds and attacking supply lines, strategies that eventually helped blunt the Mongol advance. Furthermore, the Templars' reports illuminated a path beyond mere conflict. They highlighted the Mongols' keen interest in trade and their respect for diplomatic envoys. This understanding planted the crucial seed for future engagement, most famously seen in the journeys of missionaries and merchants like William of Rubruck and Marco Polo just a few decades later. The Templar mission to Karakorum, a breathtaking blend of courage and cunning, did more than just gather secrets. It turned a monstrous, unknown threat into a comprehensible, if still formidable, geopolitical entity. They opened a window to the east, and through it, Europe caught its first glimpse of the possibilities for a connected world, paving the way for the exchanges that would one day flow freely along the Silk Road. While the Templars were assessing the military might of the Mongols in the frigid plains of Karakorum, another group of their brothers was embarking on a mission of a completely different nature, one driven not by the clash of empires but by the quiet, relentless pursuit of knowledge. Their destination was a name that would have sounded like a mythical echo to most Europeans: Timbuktu. By the late 13th century, this city in the Mali Empire was ascending to its golden age, transforming into one of the most vibrant intellectual centers on the planet, a crossroads of African, Arab, and Islamic scholarship that hummed with a level of learning that Europe could scarcely imagine. For the Templars, ever the pragmatists, this represented an untapped resource of immense strategic value. They understood that knowledge was power, and the power emanating from Timbuktu's libraries and universities was of a kind that could reshape the world. And so, a covert team of Templar agents, selected for their sharp minds and ability to blend in, was dispatched on a long and perilous journey south across the Sahara. Their mission was not to conquer territory or broker a military alliance, but to infiltrate this citadel of learning and acquire its secrets. The journey itself was a formidable trial. Disguised as traders or perhaps as Coptic Christian pilgrims on a long detour, these knights would have joined a camel caravan, enduring the brutal, sun-scorched expanse of the desert. They faced the constant threats of dehydration, sandstorms, and bandits, all while maintaining their cover and protecting the true purpose of their travel. Their arrival in Timbuktu would have been a profound cultural immersion. They found a city far removed from any European conception of Africa. Instead of a simple trading post, they encountered a sprawling metropolis of mud brick architecture and bustling markets, where the real currency was not just gold and salt, but parchment and ideas. At the heart of it all were the legendary institutions like the Sankore University, a thriving hub where thousands of students studied under renowned scholars. The air was thick with intellectual debate covering law, medicine, philosophy, and the sciences. For a European of this era, it would have been akin to stepping into the future. The Templar operatives had to move with extreme caution. As Christian knights in a deeply Islamic scholarly community, their true identity would have meant immediate expulsion or worse. They operated in the shadows, using their guise as merchants to initiate conversations, barter for manuscripts, and engage scholars in seemingly casual discussions. Their focus was razor-sharp. They sought out the most advanced texts on specific, practical subjects. They acquired treatises on astronomy that contained detailed celestial charts and calculations far more accurate than those in Europe, knowledge crucial for improving navigation. They collected medical texts from Timbuktu's libraries that described surgical procedures, anatomical details, and complex herbal remedies that were centuries ahead of European medicine, which still relied heavily on superstition and rudimentary practices. They gathered works on mathematics that explained advanced algebra and geometric principles, the foundational tools for engineering, architecture, and cryptography. The extraction and smuggling of this knowledge back to Europe was a clandestine operation in itself. Precious manuscripts were carefully concealed within shipments of more mundane trade goods, rolled up inside bolts of cloth, hidden in barrels of salt, or tucked away among personal belongings. The journey back across the desert was just as dangerous, now weighted with the immense value of their intellectual contraband. Once this treasure trove of knowledge reached Templar commanderies in the Mediterranean, the process of translation and dissemination began. The order's connections with monastic scholars and proto-universities in places like Naples and Montpellier allowed this new learning to slowly filter into the European intellectual bloodstream. While the Templars themselves may not have been the public-facing scholars, they acted as the critical conduit, the invisible pipeline that fed advanced Islamic and African knowledge into a continent that was just beginning to stir from its intellectual slumber. The impact of this secret mission is difficult to overstate. It represents the Templars in a role often overlooked, that of history's great intermediaries. At a time when Christendom and the Islamic world were frequently locked in conflict, these warrior monks demonstrated a stunning pragmatism, recognizing that wisdom had no religion and that progress demanded looking beyond one's own tradition. The advanced astronomical data they brought back would eventually contribute to the great sea voyages of exploration. The medical knowledge helped lay the groundwork for the more empirical medicine that would emerge in the later Middle Ages. The mathematical concepts seeded the minds that would later build the great cathedrals and eventually fuel the scientific revolution. This wasn't a mission that ended with a signed treaty or a conquered castle. Its victory was far more profound and enduring. It was a victory of ideas, a quiet act of intellectual bridge-building that helped pave the way for the Renaissance itself, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a sword, but a book. Even as their agents were deciphering the secrets of the stars in Timbuktu, the Templar leadership was contemplating a geopolitical gambit of breathtaking scale. looking beyond the familiar theaters of the Mediterranean and towards the rising power of the Indian subcontinent. Their strategic calculus was both brilliant and characteristically pragmatic. In the Holy Land, the order was perpetually caught between the hammer of the Egyptian Mamluks and the anvil of various Syrian emirates. The idea was to find a way to apply pressure from an entirely unexpected direction, to force their primary adversaries to split their attention and resources. Their gaze fell upon the Delhi Sultanate, a powerful and expanding Muslim empire thousands of miles to the southeast. To most European minds of the 13th century, India was a land of myth and mystery, but to the well-informed Templar strategists, it was a very real and potent military force. They understood that the Sultanate, while Muslim, had its own complex rivalries and would be primarily concerned with threats from the Mongols to its north and Hindu kingdoms to its south. The Templars saw an opening. They proposed a radical idea, an alliance of convenience with a Muslim power against other Muslim powers, based not on shared faith, but on shared enemies and, even more compellingly, shared economic opportunity. Dispatching a diplomatic mission to Delhi was a logistical marvel in itself. The journey by land would have been impossibly long and dangerous, trekking across the entirety of Persia and through the mountain passes of the Hindu Kush, all while navigating the shifting loyalties of territories recently convulsed by Mongol invasions. It is far more likely that Templar envoys traveled by sea, leveraging their naval assets. They would have sailed from a Levantine port like Acre to Aden, and then caught the monsoon winds across the Arabian Sea to the western coast of India. This route itself was a statement of their capabilities, a demonstration of their mastery over long-distance travel that few other European powers could match. Upon arrival, the Templar diplomats, likely a small team including a knight commander, a translator fluent in Persian, the language of international diplomacy, and perhaps a scribe, would have requested an audience with the Sultan. They entered a court of immense opulence and sophistication, a world away from the stark fortresses of the Crusader states. The air would have been thick with the scent of incense and sandalwood, the halls filled with courtiers adorned in fine silks and glittering jewels. The negotiations that followed were a masterclass in realpolitik. The Templars could not appeal on religious grounds, so their proposal was built on a foundation of cold, hard strategic and economic interest. They outlined a grand vision, a coordinated pincer movement. The Delhi Sultanate would apply pressure on the eastern flank of the Muslim world, perhaps by threatening trade routes or even launching naval raids into the Persian Gulf, thereby diverting Mamluk attention and resources away from Egypt and Syria. In return, the Templars offered two powerful incentives. First, they presented advanced European military technology. They brought knowledge of castle design and siege engine construction, the art of building and breaching formidable stone fortifications, which would have been of immense value to a sultanate constantly engaged in consolidating its control over a vast and often rebellious subcontinent. The second, and perhaps more enticing, offer was economic. The Templars held the keys to lucrative European markets. They proposed direct trading relations, bypassing the many middlemen who controlled the overland Silk Road and the maritime routes through the Red Sea. They offered the Sultanate access to European silver, timber, and wool, and in return they sought direct access to the source of the most coveted commodities in the medieval world, the unparalleled spices of India, especially pepper from the Malabar coast, and its exquisite, lightweight cotton textiles. Ultimately, a formal, binding military alliance never came to pass. The Sultan of Delhi, while undoubtedly intrigued, had more immediate concerns closer to home. The existential threat of the Mongol Ilkhanate on his northwestern frontier demanded his full attention. and the prospect of opening a new front in a distant conflict for the benefit of a small band of Europeans was a strategic overstretch he was unwilling to make. But to dismiss this mission as a failure would be to profoundly misunderstand the Templars' way of operating. Even in the absence of a signed treaty, the mission was a resounding success. The very act of engaging in high-level talks established a diplomatic channel and built a reservoir of goodwill. More importantly, it flung open the door to the Indian Ocean trade network for the Templars. Having made official contact, they now had the pretext and the connections to establish a covert commercial presence. Templar agents operating under the guise of traders began to embed themselves in Indian port cities, learning the complex rhythms of the monsoon-driven trade seasons, building relationships with local merchants, and starting to funnel spices and textiles directly onto their own ships. This allowed them to bypass the Venetian and Arab monopolies that had long controlled this trade, granting them immense profits and making their European commanderies wealthier than ever before. Furthermore, the transfer of military knowledge had a lasting impact. Elements of European concentric castle design began to appear in later Indian fortifications, a silent testament to this unexpected cross-cultural exchange. This mission to Delhi stands as a perfect emblem of the Templar mindset, relentlessly pragmatic, globally ambitious, and always finding a way to turn even a perceived setback into a tangible, long-term advantage. They had set out to find an ally and instead found an empire of trade, proving that sometimes the pen and the promise of profit could be far more powerful than the sword. While the Templars were negotiating in the sophisticated courts of India, another wing of the order was looking in the opposite direction, turning their backs on the crowded continents and setting their sights on the vast, empty expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. To the medieval mind, the ocean was a realm of monsters and mysteries, a terrifying void at the edge of the world, but the Templars saw something else entirely, a highway. Their vision was not limited by the maps of their time. They understood that control of the sea lanes was the ultimate strategic advantage, and that meant daring to go where no European ships had reliably gone before. Their incredible maritime capability, a fleet of advanced carracks and galleys staffed by some of the most skilled sailors of the age, was not just for ferrying troops between Cyprus and France. It was a tool for discovery. In the 13th century, decades before any official Portuguese age of discovery, Templar captains began pushing westward into the Atlantic, guided by a mix of classical legend, whispered rumors from Arab navigators, and their own sophisticated understanding of celestial navigation. They were searching for the Fortunate Isles of ancient myth, but they were also conducting a calculated, strategic survey. Their mission was to find, map, and secure island way stations that could serve as stepping stones into the unknown, extending the Order's reach and ensuring its survival no matter what happened in the volatile Holy Land. The two archipelagos they encountered could not have been more different, yet both were of immense value. The Azores, a chain of lush, volcanic islands far to the west, were utterly uninhabited, a pristine wilderness of dense forests and freshwater lakes. For the Templar sailors, weary from weeks at sea, the sight of this green paradise emerging from the blue desert must have been nothing short of miraculous. Their first task was to carefully chart the coastlines, identifying safe harbors and assessing the resources. They found an abundance of what every long-distance voyage desperately needed: towering stands of timber for repairing ships and building new ones, and countless sources of fresh, clean water to replenish their casks. They likely left small caretaker crews, a few hardy brothers and perhaps some secular sailors in their employ, to establish seasonal outposts, clear land for gardens, and assert the Order's claim. These men would have lived a solitary existence, their white mantles seeming starkly out of place against the wild, empty landscape, their primary duty to maintain this secret refuge for the next Templar vessel that might arrive. Their experience in the Canary Islands, however, was a profound lesson in cross-cultural encounter. Here, they did not find an empty land, but a thriving indigenous population, the Guanches, a Neolithic people living in isolation from the rest of the world. The initial contact between the armored, technologically advanced knights and the Stone Age islanders must have been a moment of mutual astonishment. The Templars, ever pragmatic, would not have sought conquest. Their goal was assessment and alliance. They would have been keenly interested in the Guanche knowledge of the island's resources, unique plants, sources of water, and safe anchorages. They likely traded simple European goods like iron tools or cloth for fresh food and local guidance. This interaction, one of the very first between Europeans and the native peoples of the Atlantic Islands, was a quiet, often overlooked prelude to the much more violent and exploitative colonization that would follow centuries later. For the Templars, it was a successful diplomatic engagement that secured them a friendly base of operations. The long-term impact of these voyages is almost impossible to overstate, though the Templars themselves would never live to see the full fruits of their labor. By meticulously mapping these islands and proving that transatlantic navigation was not only possible but repeatable, they shattered the geographical fears that had constrained Europe for centuries. The detailed charts and pilots' logs they created did not vanish with the order's dissolution in the early 14th century. This knowledge was almost certainly absorbed by the Portuguese Order of Christ, the direct successor to the Templars in Portugal, which inherited their assets, their ships, and most importantly, their secret archives. These very charts and reports would later end up in the hands of Prince Henry the Navigator, fueling Portugal's ambitious voyages of exploration. When explorers like Gonçalo Velho Cabral officially rediscovered the Azores in the 15th century, they didn't find untouched wilderness. They found the crumbling stone foundations of old settlements and place names that hinted at a prior claim. The Templars had provided the literal blueprint for the European age of expansion, proving that the keys to the New World were not held in the East, but waiting in the vast, promising blue of the West. Their Atlantic missions were the ultimate testament to their forward-thinking vision, a gamble on the future that would, in time, change the entire shape of the world. Yet, even as their ships were probing the empty Atlantic, the Templars were simultaneously deepening their involvement in the world's oldest and most established network of exchange, the Silk Road. This was not a mission of discovery into the unknown, but one of integration into the known, a calculated move to embed themselves at the very heart of Eurasian commerce. Imagine the scene, a long, dusty caravan of camels stretching to the horizon, laden with bundles of Chinese silk, delicate Persian ceramics, and sacks of pungent spices. For the merchants guiding these precious cargoes across the treacherous stretches of Central Asia, the journey was a calculated gamble. The real price of their goods wasn't just the cost of purchase. It was the risk of losing everything to the bands of ruthless bandits that haunted the mountain passes and arid deserts, preying on the slow-moving trains of wealth. This was the vulnerability the Templars identified and expertly exploited. They offered a service no one else could, security provided by some of the most disciplined and feared warriors of the age, now for hire. The transition from holy warrior to paid security guard might seem like a step down, but for the Templars, it was a masterstroke of strategic pragmatism. A small contingent of brothers, perhaps a dozen or so, would be assigned to a major caravan leaving from a critical hub like Antioch or one of the Armenian ports on the Black Sea. Donning their iconic white mantles over practical traveling gear and well-worn chainmail, They were a walking advertisement of both their faith and their formidable capability. Their presence alone was a powerful deterrent. An attack on a caravan was one thing. An attack on a caravan explicitly under the protection of the Knights Templar was an entirely different proposition, one that promised a fierce, professional, and costly battle. The brothers were not mere hired swords, they were experts in logistics, terrain analysis, and small unit tactics. They would scout ahead for ambush points, organize the caravan into a defensible formation at night, and establish a rotating watch. For the merchants, the fee they paid the Templars was simply a wise insurance premium, a small percentage of their potential profits that guaranteed the vast majority would actually arrive at market. But the real payoff for the order was never the fee. The true treasure was the intelligence they gathered on these long, slow marches across the roof of the world. As they trudged alongside merchants and camel drivers, the Templar Knights became sponges for information. They listened to the gossip in caravanserais, the fortified inns that dotted the route, overhearing whispers about which local warlord was rising in power, which tribal chieftain could be bribed for safe passage, and which mountain pass had been blocked by an avalanche or a rival army. They meticulously documented the shifting political alliances between the remnants of the Seljuk Turks, the rising Mongol hordes, and the various independent city-states that controlled key segments of the route. This was priceless, real-time geopolitical intelligence that would inform the Order's grand strategy for years to come. Furthermore, they were mapping the world with an unprecedented level of detail. They learned the secret paths, the hidden sources of fresh water unknown to official maps, and the optimal seasons for crossing each specific region. This knowledge gave them an unparalleled advantage in planning not just future commercial trips, but potential military campaigns. The cultural exchange was a quieter, though no less significant, benefit. For months at a time, these European knights lived, ate, and traveled alongside Muslim Persian traders, Buddhist Mongol horsemen, and Nestorian Christian merchants from the farthest reaches of Asia. They were exposed to new ideas, new technologies, and new ways of thinking. They might have seen the first compasses from China, sampled new culinary spices directly from the source, or heard astronomical theories discussed in languages they were slowly beginning to understand. This constant exposure made the Templars on the Silk Road some of the most cosmopolitan and culturally fluent individuals of their era, breaking down the parochial barriers that constrained most of their contemporaries in Europe. By choosing to protect the Silk Road, the Templars did much more than just safeguard sacks of silk and porcelain. They positioned themselves as the lubricant in the gears of transcontinental trade, reducing friction and increasing the flow of goods and ideas between East and West. They became the trusted guarantors of safe passage, a neutral force whose reputation for fairness and lethal efficiency became their most valuable currency. In doing so, they wove themselves into the very fabric of Eurasian civilization, becoming silent partners in the exchanges that would gradually, over centuries, draw a disparate world closer together. While their brothers were securing trade routes and gathering intelligence across the known world, another branch of the Templar Order was engaged in a mission of an entirely different nature, one that reached beyond geopolitics and commerce into the very heart of myth and faith. This was not a journey for spices or alliances, but a quest for an object of unimaginable spiritual power, the Ark of the Covenant. For the Templars, the legendary gold-covered chest said to contain the tablets of the Ten Commandments was more than a biblical story. It was the ultimate prize. Possessing it would grant them an unassailable aura of divine favor, legitimizing their sacred cause and potentially electrifying the morale of the entire crusading movement. Whispers and rumors had long circulated among European clergy and Eastern travelers that the Ark had been smuggled to safety in Ethiopia, specifically to the ancient holy city of Aksum. For an order founded to protect the holiest sites of Christendom, the chance to recover the holiest object of all was an irresistible siren's call. And so, in the mid-13th century, a specialized team of Templar brothers, chosen for their theological knowledge, linguistic skills, and absolute discretion, set out on a clandestine pilgrimage to the highlands of Ethiopia. Their arrival in Aksum would have been a profound experience. The city was, and still is, the spiritual heart of Ethiopian orthodoxy, a place where ancient traditions were vibrantly alive. The Templars, fresh from the stark Crusader fortresses of the Levant, found themselves in a world that felt both familiar and deeply foreign. They were surrounded by the same Christian faith, but it was expressed through unique rituals, architecture, and a lineage that traced itself back to King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. The centerpiece of this faith was the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, where local tradition held that the Ark was kept in a specially dedicated chapel, guarded by a single, lifelong monk. The Templars' objective was clear: to verify the Ark's presence and, if possible, secure it. But they quickly discovered that this was not a treasure to be claimed by force or negotiation. The sacred relic was the very soul of the Ethiopian kingdom, utterly inseparable from its identity and sovereignty. The guardians of the Ark, the clergy of Aksum, regarded the foreign knights with a mixture of curiosity and deep suspicion. They were welcoming to fellow Christians but fiercely protective of their most sacred charge. Faced with this impenetrable wall of devotion, the Templars had to adapt their strategy. A direct assault or theft was politically impossible and morally unthinkable, even for them. Instead, they shifted to a more subtle approach, engaging in prolonged theological dialogue and cultural exchange with the Ethiopian priests. They presented themselves not as plunderers but as pious scholars from the West, eager to learn from the ancient and uncorrupted traditions of their Ethiopian brethren. This posture of humility and genuine curiosity opened doors that brute force never could. Over months, perhaps even years of residence, they built relationships of trust. They were granted access to the magnificent libraries and scriptoriums of Aksum, places that housed biblical manuscripts and theological commentaries that had been isolated from the rest of Christendom for centuries. While they never laid eyes on the Ark itself, its sanctuary remained inviolate. They were permitted to study and copy other incredible artifacts, ancient psalters, illustrated gospels on goat skin vellum, and crucifixes crafted in a distinctive Ethiopian style. The intelligence they sent back to Europe was a complex tapestry of fact, speculation, and tantalizing mystery. They could not report the successful acquisition of the Ark, but they could confirm the Ethiopians' unwavering belief in its presence and their fanatical devotion to its protection. More tangibly, the Templar teams managed to quietly acquire, through gift or purchase, a number of these religious artifacts and manuscripts. These items were carefully transported back across the desert and sea, eventually finding their way into the treasuries of Templar commanderies and the private collections of allied bishops and cardinals. The impact of this transfer of knowledge was subtle but significant. These Ethiopian texts offered European scholars a new, alternative perspective on early Christian history and iconography, subtly influencing liturgical art and scholarly thought. For the Templars themselves, the mission added an incalculable layer of mystique to their reputation. The rumor that they had secrets from the East, possibly even knowledge pertaining to the Ark, began to circulate, burnishing their image as keepers of hidden wisdom and fueling the legends of their hidden treasures that persist to this day. The quest for the Ark in Aksum ultimately failed in its primary objective, but it succeeded in something perhaps more lasting. It transformed the Templars from mere warriors into seekers of lost wisdom, forever linking their story to one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. Yet even as they pursued legendary relics and guarded merchant caravans, the Templars were proving their worth in a role that required not the sword but the olive branch. The volatile frontier between the Byzantine Empire and the various Seljuk Turkish beyliks in Anatolia was a perpetual tinderbox, a region where minor skirmishes could quickly escalate into full-scale war, disrupting the vital land routes between Europe and the Holy Land. For the Templars, this instability was a direct threat to their core mission. Pilgrims, the lifeblood of their original purpose, could not travel safely, and the flow of supplies and reinforcements to their castles in the Levant was constantly jeopardized. They recognized that a battlefield victory here was often less valuable than a skillfully negotiated peace, and so they stepped into a role that few others could fill, that of the trusted, neutral mediator between two ancient and deeply distrustful adversaries. The Templars were uniquely positioned for this delicate task. To the Byzantine Greeks in Constantinople, they were fellow Christians, albeit of the Latin Rite, and a powerful military order whose strength and discipline they respected, even if they viewed them with a degree of suspicion. To the Seljuk Turks, the Templars were a known quantity formidable warriors, yes, but also pragmatic operators who honored their agreements and had a proven track record of engaging with Muslim powers on matters of mutual interest, particularly commerce. They were not seen as blind religious fanatics, but as men who could be reasoned with. This reputation for fairness and reliability was their greatest asset. A Templar diplomatic mission to a Seljuk court would not have been an arrival of preachers, but of professionals. The knights sent on these missions were undoubtedly chosen for their temperance, their knowledge of local customs and language, and their deep understanding of realpolitik. The negotiations they brokered were complex affairs, often focused on very specific, localized issues. They might mediate a dispute over grazing rights for nomadic tribes along a contested border, a conflict that had sparked retaliatory raids and threatened to draw in imperial troops. They would work to establish formal truces, sometimes lasting only a single season, that allowed merchants to move their goods without fear of confiscation or attack. Most importantly, they negotiated safe passage agreements for pilgrim caravans, creating protected corridors through Anatolia where Christian travelers could move under the guaranteed protection of both the local Seljuk ruler and the Templar order itself. These were not grand, sweeping peace treaties that ended generations of conflict. They were practical, temporary, and highly localized arrangements designed to manage conflict and reduce friction. But in a region perpetually on the brink of war, these small acts of diplomacy were monumental achievements. The benefits for the Templars extended far beyond the immediate goal of a quieter border. Every successful mediation was a deposit in the bank of trust, strengthening their credibility with both sides and opening doors that would have remained closed to others. This enhanced standing allowed them to expand their physical presence in the region dramatically. With permission from both Byzantine and Seljuk authorities, they established new commanderies and smaller fortified way stations at strategic points along the major trade and pilgrimage routes. These were not just military outposts, they were combination inns, banks, and intelligence-gathering centers. They offered safe lodging to travelers, provided letters of credit for merchants, and most crucially, served as the ears of the Templar intelligence network. The brothers stationed there would listen to the gossip from arriving caravans, noting everything from the movement of Seljuk troops to the health of a local emir, or the price of grain in a distant market. This steady stream of information gave the Templar leadership an unprecedented understanding of the political weather patterns across Anatolia, allowing them to anticipate problems and seize opportunities long before their rivals. This mission of mediation in Anatolia reveals a dimension of the Templars that is often completely overshadowed by their martial reputation. It shows a sophisticated, nuanced understanding of power that went far beyond simple military dominance. They demonstrated that influence could be built not only through force of arms but through the force of one's word, through a reputation for fairness, and through the patient, painstaking work of building bridges between hostile cultures. In the dusty meeting tents between Byzantine forts and Seljuk palaces, these warrior diplomats proved that the most lasting victories are sometimes those won without drawing a single sword, securing the order's interests and safeguarding the pathways of faith and commerce through the sheer power of pragmatic diplomacy. While the Templars were proving their diplomatic value as mediators in Anatolia, their strategic gaze was also fixed on a critical Christian kingdom clinging to survival on the very edge of the known world, the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia. Nestled in the rugged mountains and fertile coastal plains of what is now southern Turkey, this wasn't the ancient homeland of the Armenian people, but a resilient successor state forged by refugees and princes. For the Crusader states far to the south, Cilician Armenia was a vital, though often overlooked buffer, a Christian outpost that absorbed the relentless pressure from powerful Muslim neighbors like the Mamluks of Egypt and the rising Beyliks of Anatolia. By the mid-13th century, this kingdom found itself in an increasingly precarious position, caught between these Islamic powers and the terrifying new threat of the Mongol Ilkhanate sweeping in from the east. It was into this pressure cooker that the Knights Templar marched not as conquerors, but as expert military consultants with a very specific and mutually beneficial proposal. The partnership was a masterclass in strategic symbiosis. The Armenian king, keenly aware of his force's limitations against such formidable foes, desperately needed to modernize his defenses. The Templars offered exactly what he lacked: cutting-edge European military engineering and elite training. Teams of Templar brothers, many of them seasoned veterans of decades of warfare in the Holy Land, arrived in Cilicia to assess the kingdom's defensive network. They identified key strongholds that controlled mountain passes and protected the approach to the capital, Sis. Under their direction, local Armenian stonemasons and laborers began a massive construction and renovation program. They reinforced curtain walls, designed and built imposing drum towers that could withstand the impact of the latest siege engines, and redesigned gatehouses to create deadly kill zones for any attacker who managed to breach the outer defenses. These weren't just stronger castles, they were state-of-the-art fortifications incorporating the hard-won lessons of a century of Crusader warfare, but stone alone does not win battles. Simultaneously, other Templar masters began the arduous task of training the Armenian royal army. They drilled the local levies and professional soldiers in the disciplined, cohesive tactics that had made the Templars so feared on the battlefield. They taught them how to execute complex maneuvers, how to maintain formation under the terrifying onslaught of Mongol horse archers, and how to counter the aggressive infantry charges of the Mamluk slave soldiers. This knowledge transfer transformed the Armenian military from a brave but traditional force into a more professional army capable of standing its ground against the superpowers of the age. For the Armenian king, this was nothing short of a lifeline, a crucial infusion of expertise that significantly bolstered his kingdom's chances of survival in a deeply dangerous neighborhood. In return for this invaluable military aid, the Templars secured advantages that were absolutely critical to their own wider operations. The most immediate and tangible gain was access to the strategic ports of the Cilician coast, such as Ayas. These harbors became secure way stations for the Templar fleet, allowing them to control a vital segment of the sea lanes between Cyprus, the Crusader states, and the trading hubs of the eastern Mediterranean. From these ports, they could efficiently ferry troops, treasure, and supplies without relying on the often unreliable or expensive facilities of other powers. Even more significantly, they gained guaranteed safe passage along the overland routes that crisscrossed the Armenian kingdom. These were not just local roads, they were key arteries of a much larger network. One branch connected westward to the great port of Constantinople, while others snaked south and east, linking up with the ancient Silk Road and the trade routes into Persia and Mesopotamia. This logistical coup cannot be overstated. It effectively gave the Templars a secure land bridge from Europe deep into the heart of the Middle East, bypassing some of the most volatile and hostile territories. Pilgrims under their protection could travel with greater safety. Their own messengers and officials could move with unprecedented speed and security. Most importantly, it allowed them to tap directly into the flow of goods and intelligence coming from the east. Spices, silks, and information now moved along these Templar-secured corridors, enriching their coffers and informing their strategies. The collaboration with Cilician Armenia perfectly illustrates the Templar modus operandi at its most effective. They identified a partner with a critical need, provided a service no one else could offer at an expert level, and in return, extracted geopolitical advantages that extended their reach and solidified their role as the indispensable connective tissue of the medieval world, proving that sometimes the best way to build your own strength is to first strengthen an ally. Even as they fortified alliances and trade routes across the Mediterranean and Asia, the Templars demonstrated a relentless drive to push the very boundaries of the known world, turning their attention to the most remote and mysterious frontier of all, the frigid, fog-shrouded North Atlantic. While most of Europe's gaze was fixed eastward toward the riches of the Orient, a handful of Templar strategists were looking west, captivated by the same Norse sagas that spoke of vast lands beyond the sea. Their objective was not born of mere curiosity, but of a characteristically bold and calculated vision, to explore the possibility of establishing supply bases far beyond the reach of their European rivals, potentially creating a secure northern route for operations that could one day span the ocean itself. The key to this audacious plan lay in the remote Norse settlements on Greenland, distant outposts of European civilization that had been established centuries earlier but were now fading into isolation and legend. A Templar expedition, likely launched from their naval bases in England or Scotland, would have been a harrowing voyage into the unknown, battling the same treacherous currents and icebergs that had challenged Viking explorers long before them. The sight that greeted them upon reaching the eastern settlement of Greenland would have been both familiar and profoundly alien. Here were fellow Christians, Norsemen who spoke a language not entirely unlike their own, living in stone and turf longhouses that echoed the architecture of their Scandinavian homeland. But the context was utterly foreign, a stark, breathtaking landscape of towering glaciers, deep fjords, and a climate that offered only a fleeting, desperate summer. The Templars, ever the pragmatists, would have immediately begun their assessment. They sought out the local leaders, the most powerful landowners or law speakers, to understand the true state of the colony. What they discovered was a society in a state of quiet but irreversible decline. The settlers, cut off from regular contact with Norway and the rest of Europe, were struggling. Their numbers were dwindling due to isolation, a gradually cooling climate that shortened growing seasons, and increasingly limited trade options. The grandiose dreams of a thriving transatlantic hub were clearly not to be found here, at least not in the present reality. Yet, true to their nature, the Templars turned this apparent strategic disappointment into an intelligence-gathering opportunity of the highest order. They meticulously documented everything they observed, creating a comprehensive report for their superiors that was less about immediate conquest and more about future potential. They studied the remnants of Viking maritime technology, examining the sturdy design of the Nar cargo ships that had made the original crossing possible. They interviewed the few remaining seasoned sailors, absorbing their hard-won knowledge of North Atlantic navigation, how to read the subtle signs of approaching sea ice, how to use the migratory patterns of birds to locate land, and how to harness the powerful currents that flowed between Greenland, Iceland, and the mysterious lands even further west that the Norse called Vinland. This was priceless, practical seafaring lore that could not be found in any European port. Furthermore, the Templars took detailed notes on the resources available. They assessed the quality of the timber, the grazing land for livestock, and the critical availability of fresh water. Perhaps most significantly, they documented their encounters with the indigenous Thule people, the ancestors of the modern Inuit, who were then beginning to expand southward into Norse territories. The Templars would have observed a culture supremely adapted to this harsh environment, with technologies far superior to those of the struggling Norse, expertise in hunting sea mammals, crafting skin boats, and sewing weatherproof clothing. This ethnographic detail was not just academic, it was a crucial assessment of the human landscape, understanding who held real power and knowledge in this new world. The immediate, tangible result of this mission was likely a sobering recommendation against any major investment in the declining Greenland settlements. However, the long-term impact of the intelligence they smuggled back to Europe was immeasurable. The detailed charts of Greenland's coastline, the observations on climate patterns, and the compiled Viking sailing techniques did not simply vanish when the Templar Order was dissolved. This knowledge almost certainly found its way into the hands of the Portuguese Henry the Navigator and other early pioneers of the Age of Discovery, who were deeply interested in any and all information about the Atlantic. The Templars, in their methodical investigation of a fading frontier, had inadvertently preserved and transmitted the very nautical knowledge that would one day enable Columbus, Cabot, and others to successfully cross the ocean. Their journey to Greenland was a testament to their role as history's great connectors. Even in assessing a failure, they gathered the seeds of a future success, proving that no venture into the unknown is ever truly wasted. Even as the Templars were charting the icy frontiers of the North Atlantic, another division of the Order was executing a diplomatic maneuver so audacious it would have been unthinkable to most of Christendom. They were sending envoys not to a fellow Christian kingdom, but directly into the heart of a rising Muslim power on the southern shore of the Mediterranean. The Marinid dynasty of Morocco was a formidable new force, ambitious and expansionist, having recently overthrown the Almohad Caliphate and eager to establish its dominance across North Africa and into Iberia. To the kings and popes of Europe, the Marinids were simply another Islamic threat, another name on a long list of adversaries, but the Templar High Command, viewing the geopolitical chessboard with cold, pragmatic clarity, saw something else entirely: an opportunity. They recognized that the Marinids, like all new dynasties, were preoccupied with consolidating their own power and neutralizing their immediate rivals, many of whom, crucially, were also Muslim. This created a rare opening for a partnership of pure, unvarnished convenience, one that bypassed all notions of religious solidarity in favor of hard-nosed strategic gain. The journey of a Templar diplomatic mission to the Marinid court, likely in their capital of Fes, would have been a masterclass in discretion and courage. Traveling by sea from a Templar-controlled port in Spain or perhaps Sicily, the small delegation of brothers chosen for their fluency in Arabic, their understanding of Berber and Andalusian culture, and their unflappable nerves would have landed on a coast that most Europeans knew only as a source of pirates and peril. Their arrival in Fes was a plunge into a world of stunning sophistication. The city was a renowned center of Islamic learning, its labyrinthine streets filled with the scent of spices and the sound of scholars debating in the courtyards of its famous madrasas. The Templar envoys were ushered into a court of intricate mosaics and flowing fountains, a world away from the stark stone halls of their European commanderies. They were there to negotiate not as holy warriors, but as sophisticated representatives of a powerful transnational corporation. The proposal they laid before the Marinid Sultan was a brilliant piece of realpolitik, appealing directly to his dynastic and economic interests. The Templars offered two things the Sultan desperately needed. First, they provided access to coveted European goods that were difficult to acquire through traditional, often hostile, channels: high-quality iron and steel for weaponry, sturdy timber for shipbuilding, and luxury items like fine woolen cloth that would adorn his court and reward his loyal supporters. Perhaps even more valuable was the second offer: specialized military expertise. The Templars were the foremost experts in the design and defense of stone fortifications, a skill of immense value to a new dynasty looking to secure its borders against both Christian kingdoms in Spain and rival Muslim emirates in North Africa. In exchange, the Templars asked for something that would dramatically extend their operational reach: guaranteed access to key Marinid ports on the Atlantic and Mediterranean coasts. The benefits of this unexpected alliance were immediate and multifaceted for the order. Control of ports like Salé and Ceuta provided them with safe harbors where their galleys could resupply with fresh water and food, repair storm damage, and wait out the dangerous winter weather that made Mediterranean navigation so treacherous. This transformed the southern shore from a hostile coastline to be avoided into a friendly chain of way stations, drastically improving the efficiency and security of their naval logistics. But the true strategic coup was intelligence. From these secure bases, Templar agents, often disguised as merchants, could closely monitor the comings and goings of the entire Muslim naval presence in the Western Mediterranean. They could report on the movements of pirate fleets from rival states, track the war galleys of the Emirate of Granada, and gather crucial advance warning of any planned naval campaigns against Christian shipping or the southern coasts of Spain and Italy. This intelligence was a priceless early warning system that they could share or sell to European powers. Furthermore, this Moroccan backdoor gave them access to the trans-Saharan trade routes that terminated on the Atlantic coast. Now, goods like gold, ivory, and slaves, which had traditionally moved north through Mamluk-controlled Egypt, could be funneled instead through Templar-friendly Moroccan ports and onto Templar ships, directly challenging the economic dominance of their primary adversaries in the east. This mission to Morocco stands as one of the clearest examples of the Templar worldview. It completely shatters the simplistic image of a perpetual holy war between cross and crescent. Instead, it reveals an order of supreme pragmatists who understood that the lines on the map were drawn not by faith, but by interest. They demonstrated that an enemy's enemy could, however temporarily, become a friend, and that a safe port and a reliable stream of intelligence were far more valuable to the security of Christendom than any rigid adherence to a dogma of eternal conflict. In the sun-drenched courts of Fes, these knights in white mantles proved that true strategy often requires shaking the hand of a supposed adversary to gain the leverage needed to defeat a more immediate foe. While their brothers were navigating the complex politics of North Africa, another team of Templar operatives was engaged in a mission that required a completely different set of skills, not diplomacy or warfare, but the art of commercial infiltration and underwater espionage. Their target was one of the most coveted luxuries in the medieval world: pearls. The warm, shallow waters of the Red Sea, particularly around the archipelago of the Dahlak Islands, were renowned for producing the most exquisite pearls, prized by sultans, caliphs, and European royalty alike. This industry was a tightly controlled monopoly of local Arab merchants, and by extension their powerful overlords, the Mamluk sultans of Egypt. For the Templars, this represented a dual opportunity: a chance to tap into a river of wealth flowing directly from the seafloor, and a perfect cover for observing the comings and goings of the Mamluk navy, their primary adversary in the Holy Land. And so, a select group of brothers, chosen for their ability to blend in rather than stand out, was dispatched to the Red Sea coast. Their orders were to infiltrate the pearl trade and turn a profit for the order, all while keeping a watchful eye on the movements of their enemy's fleet. The first and greatest challenge was assimilation. A European knight in full regalia would have been immediately arrested or killed. These operatives therefore shed their iconic white mantles and chainmail, adopting the guise of humble merchants, perhaps from a distant corner of the Muslim world like Anatolia or Persia. They would have learned the local dialects, studied the intricate social hierarchies of the pearl diving communities, and mastered the complex rituals of negotiation in the sucks. Their entry point was likely as financiers or middlemen. Pearl diving was an incredibly perilous and capital-intensive business. Divers, often slaves or indebted workers, risked shark attacks, drowning, and decompression sickness to harvest oysters from the seabed. The merchants who owned the boats and equipment needed upfront capital to fund these expeditions. The Templars, with their vast financial resources, could provide this capital discreetly, either through a network of trusted local agents or by posing as wealthy traders themselves seeking to invest in a promising venture. Once they had a financial foothold, they began to manipulate the supply chain. They wouldn't have been on the boats themselves, but they worked to establish their own covert networks for procuring and transporting the gems. They might outbid rivals for the best catches from individual boat captains, or offer better terms to the master divers, creating a loyal cadre of suppliers who bypassed the traditional Mamluk-sanctioned merchants. The most prized pearls, perfectly spherical and gleaming with a soft, luminous light, were carefully separated from the rest. These were not destined for the open market in Cairo or Damascus. Instead, they were secreted away through a clandestine pipeline, smuggled aboard Templar-controlled vessels disguised as ordinary cargo ships, perhaps carrying hides or dates. These priceless treasures would travel up the Red Sea, be transferred across the Sinai, and then find their way onto ships bound for Cyprus and ultimately Europe. There, they would be sold discreetly to the highest bidders, kings, popes, and incredibly wealthy nobles who valued the exotic rarity of a pearl that had bypassed the usual Venetian and Genoese merchants. The markup was astronomical, pouring a steady stream of untraceable wealth into the order's deepest coffers, but the pearls were almost a secondary prize. The real intelligence goldmine was the cover the trade provided. A merchant asking questions about shipping lanes, naval patrols, or the deployment of the Sultan's fleet would be deeply suspicious. But a merchant financing pearl diving operations had a perfectly legitimate reason to be intensely interested in maritime activity. The Templar operatives needed to know the schedules of the diving boats, which were entirely dependent on weather and sea conditions. This gave them a pretext to constantly monitor the Red Sea itself. They could note the departure and return times of Mamluk war galleys from ports like Idhab and Suakin. They could casually ask their divers and boat captains what they had seen during their weeks at sea. Had they noticed any unusual naval exercises, any new ships being built in the royal dockyards, any troop transports heading north toward the Sinai, which could indicate a planned invasion of the Crusader states. this casually gathered gossip was an intelligence operative's dream. It provided a real-time picture of Mamluk naval readiness and intentions. The Templars learned the seasonal patterns of the fleet, identified the most vulnerable supply routes, and could often get days or even weeks of warning before a major naval campaign was launched from Egypt. This information was rushed back to the Templar headquarters in Cyprus and Acre, where it was analyzed and used to plan preemptive strikes, reinforce vulnerable coastal castles, or advise allied ships to avoid certain areas. The mission in the Red Sea was a masterpiece of Templar multitasking. In one single, sustained operation, they managed to bankroll their own military efforts through a wildly profitable luxury goods scam, all while running one of the most effective naval intelligence networks of the entire medieval period. It was a perfect fusion of greed and strategy, proving that for the Knights Templar, even the most beautiful and delicate treasures could be transformed into powerful weapons of war. But even as Templar agents were turning pearls into intelligence along the Red Sea, another, far more ancient legend was calling them toward a different kind of treasure, one that promised not just wealth, but a direct link to the very origins of their sacred purpose. For centuries, European scholars and theologians had pored over biblical passages, particularly in the first book of Kings, describing the fabulous wealth of King Solomon. His temple was said to be adorned with unimaginable quantities of gold, and the source of this wealth was a mysterious, distant land known as Ophir. The precise location of Ophir was one of the great geographical mysteries of the age, a subject of intense debate in monastic scriptoriums and royal courts alike. By the late 13th century, the most compelling theories, bolstered by accounts from Arab geographers and seasoned Jewish traders, pointed south far down the East African coast, toward a region of rumored golden cities and ancient mines. For the Knights Templar, an order literally named for Solomon's temple, the allure was irresistible. Finding Ophir would be more than an economic windfall. It would be a spiritual homecoming, a validation of their very identity, and potentially a source of wealth so vast it could finance the reconquest of the entire Holy Land. And so, funded by this powerful mix of faith and ambition, Templar-sponsored expeditions began pushing beyond the familiar trading ports of Somalia and Kenya, sailing into the unknown waters of the southern Swahili coast. The journey itself was a monumental feat of navigation and endurance. Their ships, sturdy Mediterranean galleys adapted for long ocean voyages, would have been pushed south by the seasonal monsoon winds, skirting a coastline that grew increasingly foreign with every league. They passed mangrove swamps teeming with wildlife, vast stretches of deserted shore, and eventually began to encounter the sophisticated stone ports of the Swahili city-states, like Kilwa and Sofala. These were vibrant, cosmopolitan hubs, where African Bantu culture blended with Arab and Persian influences, and where the air was thick with the promise of gold and ivory from the interior. The Templars, likely posing as merchants or perhaps as envoys from a distant Christian prince seeking trade, would have made landfall at these ports. Their first task was to gather information, to listen to the tales told by Arab dhow captains and local elders about the sources of the gold that arrived in dusty packets from the vast, uncharted interior. The stories spoke of a powerful inland empire, a ruler who presided over great stone cities, and of gold mines that seemed to bleed the precious metal directly from the earth. To the Templars, this sounded less like Africa and more like the descriptions of Ophir from the Bible. Their hearts must have raced with the conviction that they were on the verge of one of history's greatest discoveries. Organizing an expedition into the interior was a venture into the truly unknown. They would have hired local guides and porters, men who knew the footpaths that wound through the dense bush and across wide savanna plains. The journey inland from the coast was arduous and fraught with danger, from disease and hostile wildlife to the ever-present threat of encountering powerful, suspicious local chieftains. The Templars were searching for concrete evidence, a mine that matched the scale of Solomon's operations, or better yet, some archaeological proof like inscriptions or ruins that could definitively link this land to the biblical narrative. Their travels likely took them into the hinterlands of modern-day Mozambique and Zimbabwe, regions we now know were indeed part of the vast gold trading network of the medieval period, centered on the great stone city of Great Zimbabwe. They may even have glimpsed the distant, imposing stone walls of that kingdom's enclosures, a sight that would have seemed both awe-inspiring and strangely familiar to men whose lives were dedicated to building and defending stone fortresses. Ultimately, however, the mission failed in its primary objective. They found no lost mines of Solomon, no ancient Hebrew inscriptions, and no definitive proof that this was the biblical Ophir. The gold they did encounter was already tightly controlled by sophisticated local networks, and extracting it in the quantities they dreamed of would have required a military conquest far beyond their means. The sheer logistical challenge of operating so far from their supply lines, in a land of completely alien cultures and diseases to which Europeans had no immunity, proved insurmountable. Yet to dismiss this venture as a failure is to miss its profound historical importance. While they did not find Solomon's gold, they did something arguably more valuable. They meticulously mapped the coastline, charting safe anchorages, river mouths, and the locations of key trading ports with an accuracy previously unknown in Europe. They established the first direct contacts between a European military order and the powerful Bantu empires of the interior, building a foundational understanding of the political and economic landscape of southeastern Africa. Most importantly, they gathered and brought back to Europe a critical mass of practical, first-hand knowledge. Their detailed reports and charts did not gather dust. A century and a half later, when Prince Henry, the Navigator of Portugal, began his own systematic push down the African coast, he was not working from a blank slate. He had access to the accumulated geographical lore of the ages and the archives of the Portuguese Order of Christ. The direct successor to the Templars would have been a prime repository for precisely this kind of information. The routes the Templars had painfully pioneered, the dangers they had noted, and the tantalizing hints of gold they had reported, all served as a crucial blueprint for the Portuguese caravels that would eventually round the Cape of Good Hope and open the sea route to India. In their quest for a mythical past, the Templars had inadvertently helped map the future, proving that even a dream that is not caught can still light the way for those who follow. Even as the Templars were navigating the complex trade networks of East Africa and the Red Sea, their insatiable drive for intelligence was propelling them toward one of the most magnificent and mysterious civilizations of the medieval world. The destination was Ankara, the heart of the Khmer Empire in Southeast Asia, a city so vast and splendid that it would have dwarfed any urban center in contemporary Europe. For the Templar High Command, this kingdom represented a colossal, unknown, a powerful, wealthy, and highly organized state far to the east of their traditional adversaries. Was it a potential ally against the rising tide of Islamic powers? Could it be a future threat, or was it simply a source of unimaginable wealth and knowledge waiting to be tapped? The only way to find out was to see it with their own eyes. And so, in the late 13th century, a hand-picked team of Templar brothers, chosen for their keen intellect, observational skills, and ability to master a convincing disguise, embarked on what would be one of their longest and most culturally shocking journeys. Shedding their military garb, they adopted the identity of merchants from the distant West, their precious cargo not goods for sale, but a mandate to observe, learn, and report on every facet of this astonishing empire. The journey to Ankara was an epic in itself. Sailing from their outposts in the Levant or Cyprus, they would have caught the monsoon winds across the Indian Ocean, likely transiting through the bustling Straits of Malacca. From there, they traveled up the Mekong River or overland through what is now Thailand, finally arriving at a site that would have beggared belief. Ankara was not just a city, it was a sprawling metropolis of stone, water, and humanity, centered on the awe-inspiring temple complex of Angkor Wat. To a European knight whose idea of a large city was London or Paris, with their cramped, muddy streets and timber-framed houses, the scale and grandeur of Ankara would have been utterly disorienting. Canals and vast reservoirs known as barrays stretched to the horizon, reflecting the towering, lotus bud-shaped spires of the temples. The air hummed with a different kind of energy, the scent of exotic spices, the sounds of an unfamiliar language, and the visible power of a god-king, the Khmer emperor, who commanded the labor of millions. As merchants, the Templar spies had the perfect cover to ask questions and explore. They marveled at the architectural genius on display, but their trained eyes saw beyond the spiritual symbolism to the profound military and logistical implications. The sophisticated hydraulic engineering was a revelation. They observed how an intricate network of canals and reservoirs managed water for agriculture, preventing both drought and flood, and ensuring a stable food supply for a population that likely exceeded 1 million people. This mastery over water was a form of power they had never considered. In Europe, a besieging army might try to poison a well or divert a stream. Here, the Khmer had made themselves virtually immune to such tactics, controlling water on a colossal scale. The Templars meticulously documented these systems, understanding that the principles of such large-scale civil engineering could be adapted to strengthen their own fortresses, perhaps by creating massive moats or secure internal water supplies that could withstand years of siege. Their reports would have been filled with sketches and descriptions of the urban planning. The wide, straight causeways and concentric temple enclosures spoke of a centralized authority capable of organizing labor with an efficiency that rivaled ancient Rome. They noted the empire's military structure, the use of war elephants, and the composition of the Khmer army. While a formal alliance was likely never a serious possibility due to the sheer, insurmountable distance, the intelligence was invaluable. It provided the Templars, and later the European powers who would eventually see their reports, with a completely new benchmark for what a complex, advanced society could achieve outside the familiar confines of Christendom and the Islamic world. The true legacy of this mission, however, was not in immediate geopolitical gain, but in the slow, subtle transfer of ideas. When the Templar spies returned to the West, they brought back more than just words, they brought concepts. The notion of a city planned with geometric precision, of defenses integrated with the natural landscape and water resources, and of infrastructure as a source of both civic power and military resilience, began to seep into European thought. While no European king could ever hope to replicate Ankara, the principles behind its design influenced a new generation of military architects. Elements of concentric design, the strategic use of water defenses in castle moats, and the emphasis on self-sufficiency within fortified compounds all found echoes in the great castle builds of the later medieval period. This quiet, almost invisible import of knowledge from the jungles of Cambodia to the drawing boards of European engineers stands as a powerful testament to the Templars' most enduring role, that of the medieval world's great connective tissue, silently weaving together the disparate strands of human ingenuity across continents and cultures, ensuring that no great discovery, no matter how distant, would remain isolated for long. Yet even as they documented the wonders of Ankara, the shifting sands of global politics were forcing the Templars to reassess one of their most critical and volatile relationships, their dealings with the Mongol Empire. The rise of the Ilkhanate in Persia presented a new and complex challenge. This was not the unified Mongol horde of Genghis Khan. The empire had fractured, and the Ilkhanate ruled over a vast domain stretching from the borders of Byzantium to the Indus River. Initially, the Templars had viewed the Mongols as potential allies, a pagan force that could crush their common enemy, the Muslim Mamluks of Egypt. But in a stunning geopolitical shift that sent shockwaves through both East and West, the Ilkhanate's ruler, Ghazan Khan, officially converted to Islam in 1295. For many in Europe, this was a catastrophic development, seemingly slamming shut the door on a powerful Christian-Mongol alliance. But the Templar High Command, viewing the world through a lens of pragmatism rather than panic, saw not an ending but a new and more nuanced beginning. They understood that conversion did not erase strategic interest. The Ilkhanate, now a Muslim power, still shared a bitter and bloody rivalry with the Mamluk Sultanate. The enemy of my enemy, even if he now prays in a different direction, might still be my friend. This calculation set the stage for one of the Templars' most delicate and intellectually significant diplomatic missions. Dispatching a new embassy to the Ilkhanate court was an act of profound strategic courage. The envoys sent were undoubtedly among the order's most sophisticated operators, men who were not only skilled warriors but also articulate diplomats, fluent in the languages and customs of the East, likely including Persian, the language of administration and high culture in the Ilkhanate. Their journey took them into the heart of a civilization undergoing a dramatic transformation. The Ilkhanate capital, likely Tabriz, was a dazzling fusion of Mongol steppe culture and the ancient, refined sophistication of Persia. Here, the Templar diplomats would have navigated a court where Islamic scholars debated alongside Nestorian Christians, Buddhist monks, and Jewish physicians, all under the watchful eye of a Mongol Khan who now saw himself as a defender of the faith. The Templars' proposal was a masterstroke of realpolitik. They set aside all talk of religious unity, which was now impossible, and focused instead on a foundation of pure mutual self-interest, a shared and powerful hatred of the Mamluks. They argued for a formal military alliance, proposing a coordinated two-front war where the Ilkhanate would attack the Mamluk territories from the east, through Syria and Mesopotamia, while a renewed crusader force supported by European reinforcements would strike from the west. While this grand military pact ultimately remained elusive, hampered by the vast distances involved and the sheer logistical complexity, the mission unlocked a far more subtle and lasting victory. The very presence of the Templar embassy, their demonstrated willingness to engage with a Muslim power on pragmatic terms, created an atmosphere of unprecedented cultural and intellectual openness. The Templars, acting as intermediaries, facilitated a remarkable exchange of people and ideas. They helped arrange for the travel of Nestorian Christian scholars from the Ilkhanate to Europe, men who carried with them ancient Greek texts that had been preserved in Syriac and Arabic translations but had been lost to the West for centuries. The works of Aristotle, Galen, and Euclid began to flow back along the routes the Templars helped keep open, where they would be translated into Latin and ignite scholarly debates in the nascent universities of Paris and Bologna. In the other direction, the Templars encouraged the movement of European artists, engineers, and architects to the Ilkhanate court. These craftsmen brought with them techniques of Gothic architecture, which can be seen in the design of some Ilkhanid buildings, and European innovations in siege warfare and mechanics. Perhaps the most significant exchange was in the realm of medicine and science. Persian scholars under the Ilkhanate were the inheritors of a magnificent scientific tradition, building upon the work of giants like Avicenna, whose canon of medicine was the definitive medical text for centuries. Templar envoys, with their keen eye for valuable knowledge, facilitated the transfer of these advanced Persian medical texts, astronomical charts, and mathematical treatises to Europe. This influx of knowledge did not just enrich European thought, it revolutionized it. The sophisticated Persian understanding of anatomy, diagnosis, and herbal remedies began to supplant the more superstitious and rudimentary medical practices common in the West. Furthermore, the Templars' deep engagement with the Ilkhanate's bureaucratic and administrative systems provided them with new models of organization and finance that may have influenced their own sophisticated economic operations. This mission stands as a towering example of the Templars' adaptive genius. Faced with a seemingly disastrous religious conversion, they did not retreat into isolation. Instead, they pivoted, recognizing that even within a changed religious landscape, the currents of shared interest and intellectual curiosity could still be navigated to their advantage. They became the essential brokers in a dialogue between civilizations, ensuring that the gates of knowledge remained open even when the gates of holy war seemed to be closing, and in doing so, they helped channel the river of Eastern learning that would soon help water the seeds of the European Renaissance. While their diplomats were navigating the complex Islamic courts of Persia, another contingent of Templar operatives was operating in a world of a completely different character, the raw, bustling, and often brutal frontier of the Volga River trade network. This was not the world of polished courtiers and ancient scripts, but of hardy Nordic merchants, Volga-Bulgar fur traders, and the formidable Mongols of the Golden Horde, all converging on one of the most critical economic arteries of the medieval world. For the Templars, whose influence was traditionally anchored in the Mediterranean, the Volga represented a strategic opportunity of immense proportions. By establishing a foothold in this northern corridor, they could tap into a river of wealth that flowed completely independently of the spice routes and sea lanes dominated by their Italian rivals in Venice and Genoa. This mission required a different kind of knight, one less suited for theological debate and more for gritty commercial negotiation and survival in a land of harsh winters and even harsher dealings. The journey to the Volga would have been an epic in itself. Traveling from their commanderies in Hungary or Poland, Templar agents likely joined the caravans of merchants moving east, blending into the flow of humanity that crossed the vast Eurasian steppe. Their arrival at the great river trading centers such as Bulga or later Sarai, the capital of the Golden Horde, would have been a sensory overload. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, untanned hides, and roasting meat. The shouts of traders in a dozen different languages, Old Norse, Turkic Bulgar, Mongolian, Russian, and Arabic, created a constant din. Here, the currency of exchange was not gold coins or silks, but raw materials, bundles of luxurious sable, fox, and squirrel furs from the northern forests, ingots of silver from European mines, and tragically, lines of enslaved people captured in inter-tribal wars or Slavic territories, being sold to markets in both the Islamic world and the Mediterranean. The Templars, ever the pragmatists, did not flinch from this reality. They sought to understand it, control it, and profit from it. Their method of integration was masterful. They did not arrive as conquerors or even as overtly religious figures, which would have been deeply suspicious in this multicultural, multi-faith environment. Instead, they presented themselves as financiers and security consultants. They offered two invaluable services to the powerful Mongol khans and Bulgar princes who controlled the river. First, they provided liquidity. The Templars could offer letters of credit, a revolutionary financial instrument in this part of the world, allowing a trader in Volga to receive payment in Sarai without the peril of transporting chests of silver across bandit-infested routes. This financial innovation alone would have given them immense influence and goodwill. Second, they offered their expertise in logistics and security. The Templars organized the protection of merchant caravans traveling between key nodes on the river, using their small, highly disciplined contingents of sergeants and men-at-arms to deter the bandits and rival tribes that preyed on the valuable traffic. In return for these services, the Templars extracted a fee that was far more valuable than mere coin. They demanded a percentage of the goods themselves, paid in kind. This allowed them to build their own warehouses on the Volga, stockpiling the most valuable commodities. They now controlled a direct source of the finest furs, which were worth a fortune in the cold courts of northern Europe, and they had a hand in the flow of Slavic silver eastward and Islamic silver westward. This economic foothold was a game-changer. It broke their reliance on Mediterranean trade and gave them a powerful counterbalance to the Italian maritime republics. The wealth generated from the Volga trade funded their operations across the continent, from building castles in the Holy Land to financing diplomatic missions in France. But the true, hidden value of this mission was intelligence. A Templar warehouse on the Volga was the perfect listening post. As merchants from the farthest reaches of the Mongol Empire came to trade, they brought with them news. The brothers stationed there would have learned of political upheavals within the Golden Horde, of tensions between the Knights, and of the movement of Mongol Tumens, the feared army divisions, long before this information filtered back to Europe through traditional channels. This gave the Templars, and by extension the European monarchs they sometimes advised, a critical early warning system against the threat of renewed Mongol invasions. Their presence on the Volga transformed them from a purely Mediterranean power into a truly Eurasian one, with their financial and informational tendrils now stretching from the Atlantic to the very edge of Asia, weaving them into the fabric of a connected world long before the concept of globalization ever existed. Yet, even as they were securing trade routes and forging alliances across the known world, a different kind of quest was calling to the most intellectually curious members of the Order, a mission driven not by geopolitics or profit, but by a profound hunger for ancient, hidden wisdom. While their brothers were negotiating with khans and sultans, these Templar scholars and knights were slipping into the shadowy world of the antiquities trade along the Nile, their eyes fixed on a prize that could not be measured in gold or silver. Their target was the lost knowledge of antiquity, specifically the legendary wisdom said to be buried in the sands of Egypt, a land Europeans viewed as a vast, open-air library of biblical and pre-biblical secrets. This was not an official, sanctioned campaign, but a series of covert, unauthorized excavations conducted under the noses of the Ayyubid and later Mamluk authorities. Their goal was to physically unearth proof of a sacred past, to find artifacts and texts that could unlock powerful spiritual truths, and perhaps even grant them an edge that transcended mere military might. The focus of their search was twofold, blending biblical lore with more esoteric classical traditions. They were desperate to find any tangible evidence that could corroborate and illuminate the stories of the Old Testament. Sites mentioned in the Book of Exodus held a particular fascination. They conducted clandestine digs in the Nile Delta around the area of ancient Goshen, hoping to find some remnant of the Israelite presence or the palaces of the pharaohs who knew Moses. Further south, near Luxor, the site of ancient Thebes, they searched for the hidden tombs of wise pharaohs and the lost Hall of Records, a mythical repository said to contain the entire knowledge of the antediluvian world. But their ambitions stretched even further back into the realm of pure legend. They were captivated by the figure of Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great sage believed to be a contemporary of Moses, who is said to have penned the Hermetic texts, a body of work that promised to reveal the divine secrets of alchemy, astrology, and theurgy, the art of influencing the divine through ritual. For the Templars, finding such texts would be like discovering the user's manual for the universe, granting them a spiritual and intellectual authority that would dwarf any earthly power. Operating in Egypt was an exercise in extreme risk and delicate negotiation. They could not simply march into a village with shovels and start digging. Local authorities guarded these ancient sites, not out of a sense of archaeological preservation, but because they were often sources of valuable building stone and, occasionally, treasure that could be sold. The Templars had to work through a shadowy network of intermediaries, Coptic Christian guides who knew the desert, unscrupulous local governors who could be bribed to look the other way, and experienced Egyptian diggers who knew how to tunnel into sand without causing a collapse. Their operations were conducted under the cover of darkness, in remote wadis far from prying eyes. When they did work near populated areas like Cairo or the outskirts of Luxor, they posed as European pilgrims or merchants with an eccentric interest in old stones and papyri, always aware that discovery could mean imprisonment or execution for desecration and theft. Their successes, though fragmentary and hard-won, were nonetheless profound. They did not uncover a complete library of Hermetic wisdom or the staff of Moses, but they did manage to recover a scattered but significant collection of artifacts and texts. Fragmentary papyri, often in Greek or Coptic, were smuggled out in sealed containers, their strange diagrams and unfamiliar philosophical concepts baffling and exciting the scholars within the order. They acquired small amulets, statues of Egyptian deities that were reinterpreted as biblical figures, and copies of texts like the Corpus Hermeticum, which had been preserved in the eastern Mediterranean but were largely unknown in the West. The process of getting these treasures back to Europe was a clandestine operation in itself, with relics hidden in sacks of grain, barrels of wine, or among the personal effects of returning pilgrims under Templar protection. The impact of these recovered artifacts rippled far beyond the Order's own archives. When these texts and ideas began to slowly circulate among the intellectual circles of Europe, they acted as a cultural catalyst. The Hermetic ideals of as above, so below, the concept of a divine macrocosm reflected in the human microcosm, deeply influenced the development of medieval alchemy and mystical thought. Templar-connected scholars, often based in their commanderies in France and Italy, became quiet hubs for this new old knowledge. This intellectual current, though flowing in the shadows, never truly dried up. Centuries later, when the lost works of Plato and other Greeks were rediscovered during the Renaissance, they arrived into an intellectual environment that had already been prepared by these earlier Hermetic ideas smuggled out of Egypt. The fascination with ancient wisdom, the drive to reconcile pagan philosophy with Christian faith, and the birth of Renaissance humanism itself can all trace a part of their lineage back to those clandestine midnight digs in the Egyptian desert. This 17th mission reveals the Templars at their most complex, not just as warriors and bankers, but as seekers on a timeless quest for understanding, proving that their true armor was not just made of steel, but of an unquenchable curiosity that drove them to risk everything in search of the world's oldest secrets. While their agents were unearthing secrets in the sands of Egypt, the Templar High Command was also looking toward the rugged peaks of the Caucasus Mountains, where another Christian kingdom was fighting for its very survival against the greatest land empire the world had ever seen. The Kingdom of Georgia, under the brilliant leadership of Queen Tamar and her successors, had experienced a golden age, earning the title of a Silver Age for its cultural and military flourishing. But by the mid-13th century, that golden glow was being threatened by a storm of unimaginable ferocity, the relentless westward expansion of the Mongol Empire. For the Knights Templar, watching from their strongholds in the Levant, the situation in Georgia was not a distant tragedy, it was a critical strategic concern. Georgia was a Christian bastion, a powerful and proud kingdom that acted as a crucial buffer state on the northeastern flank of the Muslim world. If Georgia fell, the Mongols would have a clear path directly into Anatolia and the northern approaches of the Crusader states themselves. The Templars recognized that propping up this Caucasian ally was not an act of charity. It was an essential investment in their own long-term security. And so, they initiated a diplomatic and military support mission that would turn the Georgian army into one of the most formidable defensive forces on the Mongol frontier. The initial contact between the Templar envoys and the Georgian court would have been a meeting of two distinct martial cultures bound by a shared faith and a common enemy. The Georgians were renowned for their own warrior aristocracy, a fierce and proud cavalry-based force steeped in their own ancient traditions. They did not necessarily need more soldiers. What they desperately needed was the latest military technology and tactical doctrine to counter the Mongol way of war, which relied on speed, deception, and overwhelming arrow barrages from horse archers. This is precisely what the Templars provided. They dispatched a team of veteran military engineers and tactical advisors brothers who had spent decades studying and fighting against a wide variety of foes from the Mamluks to various Turkic tribes. Their first task was a comprehensive survey of Georgia's defensive network. They identified key castles and fortified monasteries that controlled the high mountain passes through which any Mongol invasion force would have to funnel. These strongholds were the kingdom's vital choke points. Under the direction of the Templar engineers, a massive program of modernization began. They introduced the concept of concentric castle design, where multiple layers of walls create deadly kill zones for any attacker who breaches the outer perimeter. They supervised the construction of massive, rounded towers that were far more resistant to siege engine bombardment than traditional square towers, whose corners were vulnerable to collapse. They improved arrow loops for crossbowmen, designed more effective murder holes over gateways, and implemented advanced water storage and drainage systems within the fortresses to withstand prolonged sieges. Beyond the stone and mortar, the Templar advisors worked directly with the Georgian High Command to revise their battlefield tactics. They drilled the Georgian heavy cavalry, the famous Monaspa Guard, in new, more disciplined formations designed to resist the Mongol tactic of the feigned retreat, a maneuver that had lured and destroyed countless over-eager European armies. They emphasized the importance of combined arms, where cavalry charges were supported by crossbowmen and spearmen holding defensive positions, creating a more resilient and versatile force capable of responding to the unpredictable Mongol tactics. In return for this invaluable military aid, the Templars negotiated a compensation package that perfectly served their global ambitions. The most immediate gain was access to Georgia's legendary mineral wealth. The mountains of the Caucasus were rich with silver, copper, and iron mines. The Templars secured favorable trading rights, allowing them to directly source these critical raw materials. Georgian silver flowed into Templar coffers, bolstering their financial reserves and providing the bullion needed for their banking operations. Georgian iron and steel, renowned for its quality, was shipped to their armories in the Holy Land and Cyprus to forge weapons and armor. But the strategic prize was even greater: access to the vital branch of the Silk Road that ran directly through Georgian territory. This northern route was an alternative to the more southern paths controlled by hostile powers. By securing safe passage and establishing a logistical presence along this corridor, the Templars effectively integrated the Kingdom of Georgia into their sprawling international network. They could now move goods, money, and information from the Black Sea ports of Georgia all the way to their headquarters in Jerusalem, bypassing rivals and creating a secure land bridge between Europe and the Middle East. This partnership with Georgia stands as a quintessential example of the Templar strategy of building peripheral alliances. They understood that their core interests in the Holy Land could not be defended solely within the Holy Land. Security was a sprawling, interconnected puzzle. By strengthening a Christian ally on the distant periphery, they were indirectly fortifying their own core. A strong Georgia meant a distracted and bloodied Mongol army, a secure northern trade route, and a steady supply of essential war materials. It was a classic demonstration of their overarching philosophy: think globally, act locally, and always ensure that every alliance, no matter how distant, serves to reinforce the central mission. In the high fortresses of the Caucasus, where Georgian and Templar banners flew side by side against the Mongol tide, the order proved that true power often lies not in standing alone, but in knowing how to build unshakable walls of friendship in the most unexpected and strategic places. Yet even as they were fortifying alliances and gathering intelligence across continents, the Templars were also captivated by one of the greatest geographical mysteries inherited from the ancient world, the source of the mighty Nile River. For centuries, since the time of the Roman Empire and even the pharaohs, the origin of this river that gave life to Egypt and shaped the destiny of civilizations had been a subject of intense speculation and legend. Classical geographers like Ptolemy had written of vast inland lakes and snow-capped mountains at the equator, theories that were debated in the scriptoriums of medieval Europe but never verified. For the Knights Templar, this was not merely an academic exercise. Their extensive operations in Egypt and the Red Sea had shown them the Nile's absolute critical importance as the lifeline of the Mamluk Sultanate, their primary adversary. Understanding its source was a strategic imperative. If one could control the headwaters, could one potentially control or threaten Egypt itself? Furthermore, the rumors that circulated spoke of a land of incredible wealth beyond the river's source, a place of gold, exotic beasts, and powerful kingdoms. And so, in the late 13th century, a Templar expedition was launched, not from the Mediterranean, but from their hard-won footholds on the East African coast, turning inward to solve a puzzle that had baffled the greatest minds for over 1,000 years. The journey into the interior was a descent into a world far more alien and challenging than any desert or mountain pass they had previously encountered. Leaving the familiar Swahili coast ports behind, the small party of brothers, accompanied by local guides and porters, would have followed the winding courses of rivers that flowed westward, hoping they would lead to the great Nile's origin. They traded their maritime charts for sketches of inland footpaths, moving from the coastal plain into the rugged highlands of what is now Ethiopia and South Sudan. The climate shifted from humid heat to cooler, misty highlands, and the flora and fauna changed with it. They documented everything with the meticulous eye of military surveyors. Their reports would have described encountering animals straight out of a bestiary, towering giraffes that nibbled at the tops of acacia trees, massive herds of Cape buffalo that shook the ground as they stampeded, and sleek leopards that vanished into the dappled light of the forest. They catalogued strange, nourishing grains like teff, and noted the complex social structures of the indigenous peoples they met, such as the Sidama and the Anuak, who were masters of the river and the land, living in ways utterly foreign to European experience. This was not a rapid military campaign, but a slow, arduous process of negotiation and observation. The Templars relied on their well-honed diplomatic skills to secure safe passage from local chieftains, often exchanging manufactured goods like iron tools, beads, or cloth for guides, food, and information. They were mapping not just geography but the human and economic landscape. They assessed the fertility of the soil, the density of valuable timber, and most importantly, the presence of mineral resources. They listened intently to stories of powerful inland kingdoms like the Empire of Katara, rumored to be rich in gold, and the Christian kingdom of Ulwa further north. Their goal was twofold: to find the geographical source and to evaluate whether this region could ever support a permanent Templar presence, a remote commandery that could serve as a base for future exploration, a hub for tapping into the rumored wealth of the interior, or even a strategic lever to be used against Egypt far downstream. Ultimately, the mission fell short of its primary objective. The true sources of the Nile, the Great Lakes of Victoria and Albert, and the high springs of Rwanda remained hidden, still centuries away from European discovery. The immense scale of the Sud, a vast and impenetrable swamp in what is now South Sudan, likely proved an insurmountable barrier, a maze of papyrus and stagnant water that swallowed rivers and confounded navigation. After months or even years of effort, facing disease, the loss of men, and the sheer, overwhelming scale of the task, the expedition would have been forced to turn back. Yet to label this journey a failure is to profoundly misunderstand its impact. The Templars did not return empty-handed. They brought back something arguably more valuable than a single coordinate on a map. They brought back knowledge. Their detailed accounts and carefully drawn sketches of the upper reaches of the Nile's tributaries, the cultures that lined its banks, and the realities of the African interior were a quantum leap beyond the myths and classical speculation that had passed for geography in Europe. They replaced fantasy with fact, replacing tales of dog-headed men and rivers of fire with realistic descriptions of landscapes, peoples, and resources. This hard-won intelligence did not languish in a secret archive. It circulated among the Order's network of scholars and allies, slowly filtering into the geographic consciousness of Europe. Their reports provided the first credible, first-hand corrections to Ptolemy's ancient maps in over a millennium, charting a more accurate course for the great river through its upper reaches. This information became a foundational layer of understanding for all future exploration. When the Portuguese explorers of the 15th and 16th centuries began their own systematic push into the African interior, they were not starting from zero. They were building upon the foundational, if fragmented, knowledge acquired by the Templars. The 19th mission to find the source of the Nile stands as a powerful testament to the Order's driving spirit. It was a venture fueled by equal parts classical curiosity, strategic calculation, and an unquenchable thirst to peel back the blank spaces on the map. They demonstrated that the world was knowable, that its mysteries were meant to be pursued, and that even a mission that did not reach its final destination could still illuminate the path for all who would follow, forever expanding the boundaries of the possible. But while the Templars were charting the upper reaches of the Nile, another, far more lucrative river was commanding their attention, a river of spice that flowed from the lush, tropical forests of India's Malabar coast. By the late 13th century, the appetite for pepper, cardamom, cinnamon, and ginger had become an insatiable obsession in Europe. These were not mere flavorings, they were symbols of status, essential preservatives, and the cornerstone of a vast economic system. Yet this system was ruthlessly controlled by a powerful duopoly. Arab merchants dominated the shipping lanes across the Indian Ocean, carrying the precious cargo from Indian ports to the entrepots of Alexandria and Beirut. From there, Italian merchants, primarily the Venetians and Genoese, took over, transporting the spices across the Mediterranean and marking up the price to astronomical levels for European consumers. For the Knights Templar, perpetually in need of vast sums to fund their military operations, this arrangement was not just inefficient, it was an affront. They saw a glaring vulnerability in the chain, a chance to insert themselves between the producer and the final buyer, and in doing so, to seize control of the most valuable trade flow of the medieval world. Their plan was as audacious as it was simple: go to the source, using the intelligence gathered from their earlier diplomatic mission to the Delhi Sultanate and their growing familiarity with the monsoon patterns of the Arabian Sea. The Templars dispatched a fleet of their most seaworthy vessels from their base in Cyprus. This was not an armada of warships, but a fleet of fast, agile merchant cogs, chosen for their cargo capacity and ability to navigate coastal waters. Their journey was a calculated gamble on the seasonal winds, timing their departure to catch the southwest monsoon that would sweep them across the ocean to the Indian coast. Upon arrival, they faced their first major challenge: establishing a foothold in a landscape of sophisticated, ancient trading ports like Calicut and Cochin, which were already thriving hubs of international commerce, accustomed to dealing with Arab, Chinese, and Jewish merchants. The Templars could not arrive as conquerors. They were vastly outnumbered and operating thousands of miles from any hope of reinforcement. Instead, they came as a new kind of merchant, one with a unique proposition for the local Hindu rulers known as Zamorins. Their strategy was a masterclass in economic persuasion. The Arab merchants, while long established, often operated as a cartel, using their collective power to dictate prices to the Indian producers. The Templars, by contrast, offered the Zamorins a compelling alternative. They presented themselves as a direct pipeline to the wealthy markets of Europe, bypassing the Arab middlemen altogether. They offered to pay for spices in silver bullion and high-quality European goods, fine Flemish wool, Tuscan glassware, and Baltic amber items that were rare and highly valued in India. Furthermore, they offered something even more valuable: consistency. The Templars represented a centralized, well-funded, and reliable organization. A deal struck with a Templar factor was a deal guaranteed by the entire financial and military might of the order, not subject to the whims of an individual merchant prince. This promise of stable, long-term, and lucrative trade partnerships was incredibly attractive to the Indian rulers, who granted the Templars permission to establish small, fortified trading posts, known as fetorias, on the outskirts of the major port cities. These compounds became the nerve centers of the Templars' covert economic war. Behind their wooden palisades and guarded by a small contingent of sergeants at arms, the brothers operated with ruthless efficiency. They employed local interpreters and brokers to negotiate directly with the pepper growers and guilds, cutting out the local Arab wholesalers. They standardized quality control, ensuring that the pepper they shipped was pure and unadulterated, building a reputation for reliability that their competitors could not match. The most critical part of the operation was the loading of the ships. Under the cover of darkness or during the chaotic hustle of the port, sacks of pungent black pepper and bundles of aromatic cardamom were transported from Templar warehouses directly onto Templar ships. These vessels would then wait for the shift in the monsoon winds, which would blow them back across the Indian Ocean to the Gulf of Aden and up the Red Sea to their secret ports, or alternatively, around Arabia and back to Cyprus. The impact of this operation was immediate and profound. For the Templar order, the profits were staggering. By eliminating the multiple layers of markup, they were able to purchase spices at the source for a fraction of the cost they would have paid in Alexandria. This new revenue stream dwarfed the income from their European estates and banking operations, pouring a veritable river of gold into their treasury that funded the construction of new castles, the hiring of more mercenaries, and the financing of ever more ambitious missions. But the long-term, world-changing consequence was the route itself. The Templars had done what no European power had managed for centuries. They had successfully and repeatedly navigated the direct sea route to India. The detailed nautical charts they created, logging the monsoon patterns, coastal landmarks, safe anchorages, and potential hazards, were among their most closely guarded secrets. These charts, along with the practical knowledge of how to manage the long ocean voyage, did not simply disappear when the order was dissolved in the early 14th century. This priceless repository of knowledge was inherited by the Portuguese Order of Christ, the spiritual and material successor to the Templars in Portugal. It was this accumulated wisdom that ultimately found its way into the hands of Prince Henry the Navigator and decades later into the cabin of Vasco da Gama. When da Gama's fleet rounded the Cape of Good Hope and sailed into the Indian Ocean in 1498, he was not sailing into the complete unknown. He was following a trail of sea lore and mapped waypoints that the Templars had blazed more than 200 years earlier. Their covert mission to the Malabar coast was far more than a simple business venture. It was a foundational act of global economic disruption that cracked open the old monopolies and literally charted the course for the entire age of discovery, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon for changing the world is not a siege engine, but a shrewdly negotiated trade contract. Even as the Templars were revolutionizing global trade from the humid coastlines of India, another team of their most resilient brothers was undertaking what might have been the single most physically demanding journey in the entire history of the Order, a mission that would push them to the absolute limits of human endurance and into one of the most spiritually potent landscapes on Earth. Their destination was the Tibetan Plateau, the legendary Roof of the World, a place so remote and elevated it existed more in the realm of myth than geography for medieval Europeans. The motivation for this staggering undertaking was a piece of strategic calculus that only the Templars, with their truly global perspective, could have conceived. They were aware, through their extensive networks across Central Asia, of the rising power of Islamic sultanates and khanates. The idea was to seek out any and all potential allies who might apply pressure to the eastern flank of this Islamic world. Rumors passed along the Silk Road by Buddhist monks and Nestorian merchants spoke of a powerful and deeply spiritual realm hidden behind the world's tallest mountains, a land of formidable warrior monks and ancient wisdom. For the Templars, themselves an order of warrior monks, the parallels were instantly intriguing. Could these distant Buddhists be natural allies against a common foe? And what powerful knowledge might they possess, sealed for centuries in their high-altitude monasteries? And so, a small, specially selected team of envoys was assembled, their orders to cross the Himalayas and make contact. The journey itself defies modern comprehension. Setting out from one of their way stations in the foothills of the Himalayas, perhaps in Kashmir or Nepal, the small party of brothers would have traded their chainmail for layers of wool and fur, their war horses for sure-footed yaks or local ponies. They were leaving the known world behind, ascending into a realm of thin, biting air, blinding white glaciers, and passes so high that a misstep could mean a plunge into oblivion. They would have relied entirely on the expertise of local Sherpa guides, men who knew the moods of the mountains and the secret paths that wound through the rock and ice. For weeks, they would have trudged through a landscape of breathtaking beauty and profound danger, battling altitude sickness, snow blindness, and the ever-present risk of avalanche. The sheer physical and psychological toll of such a trek, undertaken without any of the modern equipment we take for granted, marks this mission as one of supreme courage and dedication. Their arrival on the high plateau would have been a moment of surreal revelation. After the brutal ascent, they found themselves in a vast, open land of intense blue skies and golden light, dotted with serene lakes and dominated by the awe-inspiring architecture of Tibetan Buddhism. The majestic, white-walled Potala Palace and the countless monasteries, or gompas, clinging to the sides of mountains like fortresses of faith. The initial contact between these weathered Christian knights from the west and the red-robed lamas of the east must have been a scene of mutual, cautious fascination. Communication would have been a monumental challenge, likely conducted through a chain of interpreters translating through multiple languages, from Latin or French to Persian to Tibetan. The Templars' proposal would have been framed in the pragmatic terms of realpolitik that had served them so well elsewhere. They would have spoken of the rising power of Muslim empires to the west, suggesting a strategic alliance between their two spiritual empires to counter a common threat. They presented themselves as the military and diplomatic representatives of a vast Christian world, seeking friendship and mutual cooperation with the spiritual leaders of Tibet. The Tibetan lamas, for their part, were likely less interested in the geopolitics of distant lands than they were in these strange visitors themselves. They would have seen the Templars not just as envoys, but as a unique spiritual phenomenon, men who, like themselves, had taken vows of poverty and obedience and dedicated their lives to a higher purpose, yet who did so through the profession of arms. This fascinating parallel warrior-monk meeting warrior-monk would have created a unique basis for dialogue that transcended the vast theological differences between their faiths. While a formal military alliance was almost certainly never a realistic outcome, the distances involved were simply too vast for any meaningful coordination. The mission succeeded in ways that were far more subtle and lasting. The Templars, ever the keen observers, would have absorbed invaluable intelligence on the political landscape of Central Asia. They learned about the power dynamics between the various Tibetan schools of Buddhism, the influence of the Mongol Yuan dynasty in China over the region, and the stability of the overland routes that connected Tibet to the rest of the continent. This geopolitical data was a priceless addition to their global intelligence map, but the true, hidden treasure of this mission was the cultural and intellectual exchange. The Templars were granted a glimpse into a profound and complex spiritual world. They would have witnessed debates on philosophy that lasted for days, intricate rituals involving sacred art and music, and meditation practices aimed at mastering the mind itself. They likely received gifts of sacred texts or intricate thangka paintings, artifacts that would have been studied with intense curiosity back in Europe. While no definitive proof exists, it is tantalizing to consider that certain Eastern philosophical concepts, or even designs of mandalas representing cosmic order, might have indirectly influenced the development of European mystical thought and the symbolic architecture of later Gothic cathedrals. The Templar mission to Tibet stands as the ultimate testament to their boundless ambition and their radical open-mindedness. It was a journey that served no immediate tactical goal and secured no tangible territory, but it demonstrated a willingness to reach across the highest barriers on Earth, both geographical and cultural, in the perpetual pursuit of knowledge and strategic advantage, forever expanding the horizons of what was thought possible in the medieval world. And now we arrive at perhaps the most controversial and tantalizing of all the Templar missions, a story that, if true, would completely rewrite the history of the New World. While their documented journeys to the Azores and Greenland were remarkable feats of Atlantic navigation, they pale in comparison to the staggering possibility that Templar sailors, generations before Columbus, not only reached the Americas but ventured deep into the heart of the Amazon basin. This idea pushes the boundaries from established history into the realm of highly speculative but fascinating theory. Yet it is a theory supported by a compelling collection of architectural oddities, cultural echoes, and the undeniable fact that the Templars possessed both the means and the motive to attempt such a voyage. The journey would have relied on their profound understanding of the Atlantic's hidden highways, the great circular currents known as gyres. Sailing from their secret bases in the Azores or even from the Cape Verde Islands, a Templar ship caught in the South Equatorial Current would have been carried relentlessly westward, a passive passenger on a river of ocean that flows directly toward the bulging coast of Brazil. The true test of seamanship would come not during the crossing, but at its end as the sailors spotted land, not the familiar contours of an island, but an endless emerald wall of vegetation unlike anything in the European world, with a muddy, freshwater current so powerful it pushes the salt water of the ocean back for miles. They would have found the mouth of the Amazon. The initial encounter with this titanic river and its people would have been a moment of profound mutual astonishment. For the indigenous Tupinamba or other coastal tribes, the arrival of a large, square-sailed ship and men clad in strange garments of metal and cloth would have been a world-shattering event, perhaps incorporated into their cosmology as the coming of spirits or gods. For the Templars, it was the discovery of a completely unknown continent teeming with life, from vibrant macaws and noisy monkeys to unseen insects and immense river fish. Their primary objective, as always, would have been exploration and assessment. Following the immense river inland in their longboats, they would have been overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the ecosystem, the oppressive humidity, the cacophony of the jungle, and the mind-boggling biodiversity. They were not there as conquerors. A handful of men in the vastness of the Amazon could only be explorers or guests. Their mission would have been to map this new world, to document its resources, and to establish peaceful contact with its inhabitants, seeking knowledge and perhaps the source of the strange, valuable goods they might have encountered, like colorful parrot feathers or unusual hardwoods. It is in the aftermath of such a hypothetical contact that we find the most intriguing, albeit hotly debated, evidence. Across the Amazon basin, there are enigmatic archaeological sites that defy easy explanation. The most famous is the complex of stone structures at the top of a mountain in Guyana known as the Stonehenge of the Amazon. This site, with its precisely arranged, massive stone blocks, stands in stark contrast to the typical wooden and thatch architecture of the region. While mainstream archaeology suggests it is of indigenous origin, its unusual design has led some to speculate about outside influence. Even more compelling are the persistent legends among certain Amazonian tribes. Some speak of ancient, pale-skinned, bearded visitors who came from the ocean, bringing with them knowledge of astronomy and agriculture. These visitors, known in various legends as civilizing heroes, are said to have taught the people how to farm the difficult rainforest soil using sophisticated techniques and passed on complex understandings of the celestial cycles. To a people without a written history, such a monumental event would be preserved not in archives but in myth, passed down through generations as a foundational story. The parallels to descriptions of bearded European knights are, at the very least, a remarkable coincidence. The potential implications of this mission are nothing short of earth-shattering for our understanding of history. It suggests that the first sustained contact between the old world and the new was not one of immediate conquest and disease, but a fleeting, earlier chapter of curiosity and exchange, led not by a Genos explorer sailing for Spain, but by the network of warrior monks who had already made the world their stage. It positions the Templars not merely as participants in medieval history, but as the true, unacknowledged pioneers of the Age of Discovery, their secret voyages laying the psychological and cartographical groundwork for the expeditions that would follow centuries later. Their knowledge, locked away in the Order's most guarded archives and perhaps passed down to their Portuguese successors in the Order of Christ, could have been the hidden catalyst that finally gave Europe the confidence to sail into the Atlantic's western unknown. If even a fraction of this theory is true, then the Knights Templar's legacy extends far beyond castles and crusades, reaching across an ocean to touch the very bedrock of the New World long before history officially says it was ever found. Yet even as they explored the farthest reaches of the Amazon and the high plateaus of Tibet, the Templars never lost sight of the fact that their power ultimately rested on controlling the beating heart of medieval commerce, the warm, blue waters of the eastern Mediterranean. Here, amidst a complex web of shifting alliances and bitter rivalries, they executed one of their most sophisticated and pragmatic maneuvers, forging a partnership that would have seemed unthinkable to an outsider. On the surface, the Knights Templar and the Republic of Venice were natural competitors. The Order was a theocratic military power, sworn to a life of poverty and service, while the Serene Republic was the epitome of mercantile capitalism, a state governed by merchants for the sole purpose of generating wealth. Their core values could not have been more different, but in the strategic chessboard of the late 13th century, their most vital interests converged on one critical square, the island of Cyprus. For both powers, Cyprus was not just another piece of territory. It was the essential linchpin for dominance over the entire Levant. The Templars, having been expelled from their last strongholds on the mainland like Acre, desperately needed a secure, fortified base from which to launch any future operations and to manage their vast financial and intelligence networks. Cyprus, just a day's sail from the coast, was the perfect redoubt. For the Venetians, the island was the key to their entire commercial empire. It sat astride the sea lanes that connected their markets in Constantinople and the Black Sea to their outposts in Egypt and the Levant. Controlling Cyprus meant they could protect their merchant convoys from their arch-rivals, the Genoese, and from the ever-present threat of Mamluk corsairs. Recognizing this powerful alignment of needs, the leadership of both entities made a calculated decision to set aside their philosophical differences. This was not a merger of hearts and minds, but a cold, hard marriage of convenience, a joint venture built on a foundation of mutual self-interest. The negotiations would have been conducted by the most pragmatic minds in both organizations, men who spoke the universal language of power and profit. The Templars offered the Venetians something they could not buy with all the gold in their treasury: unparalleled security. The Order's fleet, while smaller than Venice's mighty navy, was staffed by some of the most disciplined and experienced warrior sailors in the Mediterranean. A Templar galley flying the Red Cross Pate alongside the Venetian Lion of St. Mark was a formidable deterrent to any pirate or Genoese captain considering an attack on a merchantman. Furthermore, the Templars provided the Venetians with access to their sprawling intelligence apparatus. Reports on Mamluk fleet movements gathered from their spies in Alexandria, and warnings of Genoese political machinations gleaned from their agents in Italian ports. This early warning system was worth more than a fleet of warships. In return, the Venetians gave the Templars access to something they desperately needed: world-class maritime logistics. The Venetian arsenal was the most advanced shipbuilding complex in the world, a pre-industrial production line that could turn out a fully equipped galley in a single day. Through this alliance, the Templars could have their own vessels repaired, refitted, or even rebuilt to Venetian standards, drastically increasing the range and effectiveness of their fleet. More importantly, the Templars gained the right to transport their goods and personnel on the vast network of Venetian merchant vessels. This allowed them to move men and money across the Mediterranean with a speed, reliability, and anonymity that they could never have achieved on their own. A Templar treasurer could now travel from London to Cyprus disguised as a humble Venetian cloth merchant, his identity and his gold hidden in plain sight amidst the bustling cargo of a Venetian cog. The practical collaboration on Cyprus itself was a masterclass in cohabitation. In the port cities like Famagusta and Limassol, Venetian merchants established their bustling warehouses and trading houses right alongside newly built Templar commanderies, which functioned as fortified banks, barracks, and intelligence hubs. This physical proximity created a powerful synergy. A Venetian spice merchant could secure a loan from the Templar treasury just steps from his wharf, using his next shipment as collateral. Meanwhile, the Templar brothers stationed there could mingle in the taverns and markets, listening to the gossip from newly arrived sailors' gossip that might contain a vital snippet about a Mamluk fleet preparing to sail or a political assassination in Cairo. This free flow of information and capital made Cypriot ports under their joint influence the most efficient and secure commercial centers in the region, outshining those controlled by their Genos rivals. This alliance illustrates the absolute pinnacle of Templar pragmatism. It reveals an order that had completely transcended the simplistic Crusader ideology of its early days. They were no longer just soldiers of Christ, they were geopolitical entrepreneurs capable of partnering with anyone, even a state often accused of trading with the Muslims they were sworn to fight, if it served their long-term strategic survival. In the harbors of Cyprus, the sacred and the profane found a common purpose, proving that in the complex game of global influence, the most powerful alliance is often not between friends, but between interests. While their brothers were navigating the complex political waters of the Mediterranean, a different kind of Templar operative was at work in the arid, mountainous highlands of Yemen, their attention captured not by gold or spices, but by a humble bean that would one day fuel the modern world. In the 13th century, the coffee plant was virtually unknown outside of the Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa. Its use was largely confined to Sufi Muslim mystics, who valued the potent brew made from its roasted and ground seeds for its ability to ward off sleep during long nights of prayer and devotional chanting. To most Europeans, if they had heard of it at all, it was a strange Eastern curiosity, a drug associated with Islamic ritual. But the Templar agents stationed in Yemen, ever observant and attuned to any potential advantage, saw something far more valuable. They recognized in this stimulating beverage a combination of medicinal utility, social potential, and, most importantly, immense economic opportunity. Their mission was not one of conquest or diplomacy, but of careful, clandestine observation and acquisition, to understand this novel commodity and find a way to transplant it, both literally and culturally, to the West. The Templar operatives, likely operating from the port city of Aden, would have had to travel inland to the fertile terraces where the coffee shrubs, known as Coffea arabica, were cultivated. Posing as merchants interested in local commodities, or perhaps even as travelers curious about Sufi practices, they began a meticulous study of the entire process. They documented the specific growing conditions, the high altitude, the well-drained soil, the precise amount of rainfall and shade needed for the plants to thrive. They observed the harvest, noting how the bright red coffee, cherries were picked and how the beans were extracted, dried, and sorted. Most crucially, they studied the preparation. They learned the intricate rituals of roasting the green beans over fire until they turned dark and fragrant, then grinding them into a fine powder before infusing them in hot water. They noted the social context in which coffee was consumed not just in monasteries, but in early versions of public houses where men would gather to talk, listen to music, and share news. The Templars understood that they were witnessing more than a recipe. They were observing the birth of a social custom, and they grasped its potential to be replicated and monetized. The real challenge was one of logistics and stealth. Coffee plants were a closely guarded resource, and the export of viable seeds was almost certainly forbidden by local rulers who wished to maintain their monopoly. The Templars had to employ all their skills in clandestine acquisition. They likely bribed local farmers to secure a quantity of unroasted, green coffee beans, the only kind that could still germinate. These precious seeds had to be kept alive and moist during a long, perilous journey. Smuggling them out required ingenious concealment. They might have been hidden in sacks of more mundane trade goods like dates or hides, or sewn into the linings of traveling cloaks. Along with the physical seeds, the Templars also collected the intangible knowledge, the detailed notes on cultivation, the roasting techniques, and the brewing methods. This information was as valuable as the beans themselves. The journey of this cargo back to Templar territories was a race against time and the elements. The beans had to be transported by camel across the desert to a Red Sea port, placed on a ship, and kept ventilated and dry to prevent mold during the sea voyage. Their first likely destination was Cyprus, the Order's great logistical hub in the eastern Mediterranean. There, in the gardens of a Templar commandery, the first experimental coffee plants in European-controlled territory were probably sown. The initial goal may have been medicinal. The Order's extensive network of hospitals and infirmaries would have been keenly interested in a substance known to increase alertness and ward off fatigue. They might have prescribed it to their own knights on long watch duties or to the sick as a stimulant, but the long-term impact of this covert agricultural theft was nothing short of a social revolution. The knowledge and the seeds the Templars smuggled out of Yemen were the spark that would, over the following centuries, ignite a global phenomenon. While the Order itself was dissolved before it could capitalize on coffee on a mass scale, the foundation they laid was critical. The know-how they acquired filtered into monastic communities in Europe, particularly among other military orders and inquisitive monks who began cultivating the plant. By the 17th century, coffee had exploded in popularity, leading to the establishment of the first coffee houses in England and continental Europe. These establishments, which directly mirrored the social settings the Templars had observed in Arabia, became known as penny universities, places where for the price of a cup, people from all walks of life could gather to discuss politics, philosophy, and business. Coffee replaced alcohol as the daytime beverage of choice, leading to a more sober, alert, and intellectually engaged populace, a shift that many historians argue was a crucial catalyst for the Age of Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. The Templar mission to Yemen thus stands as a perfect example of their role as history's great cultural intermediaries. They were not just warriors or bankers, they were keen observers and importers of innovation. In recognizing the potential of a simple bean, they set in motion a chain of events that would forever alter the daily rhythms, social structures, and economic landscapes of the entire Western world, proving that sometimes the smallest seeds can grow into the most world-changing of legacies. Yet even as they were introducing coffee to the West and securing their interests in the Mediterranean, the Templars were preparing for their most ambitious diplomatic play yet, a mission that would see their envoys travel further east than any European had ever gone before, all the way to the sumptuous court of the most powerful man on earth. The rise of Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis, represented a seismic shift in global power. He had completed the conquest of China, established the magnificent Yuan dynasty, and ruled an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Hungary. For the Templar leadership, observing these developments from their intelligence hubs across Asia, Kublai was the ultimate geopolitical puzzle and the ultimate potential ally. Previous missions to the Mongols had been to the courts of the Ilkhanate in Persia or the Golden Horde in Russia, but this was different. This was the source, the very heart of Mongol power. The strategic calculation was breathtaking in its scope. If they could secure a formal alliance with the Great Khan himself, they could orchestrate a vast, continent-spanning pincer movement. The Mongol armies would crush the Mamluks and other Islamic powers from the east, while a revitalized crusader force, backed by European kings and buoyed by this powerful new friendship, would attack from the west. It was a grand vision to reshape the entire world order, and the Templars were the only organization with the reach, the audacity, and the diplomatic skill to even attempt it. The journey to reach the Yuan court was an epic worthy of legend, a grueling overland trek of thousands of miles that would have taken the better part of a year. The Templar diplomats, a small team undoubtedly comprising a high-ranking knight, a translator fluent in Mongol and Persian, and a scribe to document everything, would have followed the ancient Silk Road. Their path took them through the brutal, wind-swept passes of the Pamir Mountains, across the terrifying emptiness of the Taklamakan Desert, whose name ominously translates to place of no return, and through the bustling, multicultural caravanserais of Central Asia. Every step was a lesson in the immense scale and diversity of the Mongol Empire. Finally, they arrived at their destination, Kublai Khan's capital, most likely at his summer palace of Shangdu, the fabled Xanadu of later poetry, or his grand capital of Konbalik, modern-day Beijing. The sight that greeted them would have dwarfed anything they had ever seen in Europe. This was not a city of stone and wood, but a planned metropolis of breathtaking scale and order, a testament to the administrative genius and absolute power of the Khan. The audience with Kublai himself was the culmination of their perilous journey. They were led into a court of unimaginable opulence, a world of silk, jade, and gold, where the air was thick with the scent of rare incense and the murmur of a dozen different languages. The Great Khan, surrounded by his ministers, Tibetan lamas, Muslim administrators, and Nestorian Christian advisors, presided over a court that was a microcosm of his global empire. The Templar envoys, wearing their simple white mantles amidst this dazzling display, presented their credentials and their grand proposal. They spoke of the shared enemy in the Mamluks, of the potential for a new era of peace and trade between East and West under their joint oversight, and of the spiritual kinship between the Khan's noted tolerance and their own Christian faith. They likely presented gifts of European marvels, perhaps a finely crafted mechanical clock, a beautifully illuminated Bible, or a sample of the finest European steel, to demonstrate the value and sophistication of the world they represented. While the grand military alliance the Templars dreamed of never formally materialized, the vast distances and Kublai's own preoccupations with consolidating his rule in China and launching invasions of Japan and Java made such coordination logistically impossible. The mission was far from a failure. In the months they spent at the Yuan court, the Templar diplomats achieved something even more profound than a treaty. They became conduits for the greatest transfer of technology and ideas the medieval world would ever see. They were given unprecedented access to the technological marvels of Chinese civilization. They witnessed the awesome power of gunpowder, not just as a novelty for fireworks, but organized into functional projectile-firing weapons, an innovation that would eventually revolutionize European warfare. They saw the process of block printing and movable type, a method for mass-producing knowledge that would lay the groundwork for the Gutenberg press and the explosion of literacy centuries later. They studied advanced Chinese nautical inventions like the stern post rudder and magnetic compasses far more sophisticated than those in Europe, along with intricate astronomical instruments that mapped the heavens with stunning accuracy. The Templars meticulously documented all of this, gathering not just objects but knowledge. They acquired maps of stunning detail that included sea routes to Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean, charts that would later fuel European dreams of a sea route to the Orient. They collected treatises on medicine, agriculture, and mathematics. When they finally began the long journey back to the West, their saddlebags were not filled with gold, but with something infinitely more valuable: the seeds of the future. The intelligence they brought back slowly filtered into the scholarly and technological circles of Europe, often through the Order's own network of connected monasteries and universities. The knowledge of gunpowder chemistry, for instance, began a slow evolution in European arsenals, first in crude bombs and later in the cannons and handguns that would end the age of the knight forever. The principles of printing, while not immediately adopted, planted a crucial idea about the replication and dissemination of information. This mission to the court of Kublai Khan represents the absolute pinnacle of the Templar vision. It was no longer about defending a castle or winning a battle. It was about engaging with the world in its entirety, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. They reached across the entirety of the known world to shake hands with an emperor, and in doing so, they opened a conduit through which the wisdom of the East could flow into the West, helping to end the medieval age and usher in the modern one. Their ambition was nothing less than to diplomatically wire the world together, and for a fleeting moment they very nearly succeeded. From the misty highlands of Ethiopia to the dazzling court of Kublai Khan in China, the true legacy of the Knights Templar stretches far beyond the battlefields of the Holy Land, weaving a hidden tapestry of global connection that forever altered the course of history. These 25 forgotten expeditions were not mere side adventures or the fanciful travels of a few rogue knights. They were the calculated, strategic endeavors of a truly transnational organization, a medieval superpower that thought in terms of continents and oceans while others were still squabbling over fields and fiefdoms. What these missions reveal is an order of breathtaking complexity and adaptability, a brotherhood that could be both devout and ruthlessly pragmatic, that could wield a sword in one hand and a merchant scale in the other, and that understood centuries before anyone else that knowledge was the ultimate currency and connectivity was the ultimate power. They were warriors, yes, but also diplomats forging unlikely alliances with Muslim sultans. They were bankers, but also spies smuggling priceless intelligence across deserts and seas. They were monks, but also explorers charting unknown coastlines under unfamiliar stars. This multifaceted identity is what allowed them to shape the very contours of our modern world in ways that have, until now, been lurking in the shadows of history. Their impact resonates through the centuries in the most fundamental aspects of our global society. The trade routes they secured and expanded, from the spice markets of India to the fur trading posts on the Volga, laid the early groundwork for the economic interdependence we know today. The diplomatic channels they opened, often in the most unexpected places, demonstrated that dialogue could sometimes achieve what decades of warfare could not. And perhaps most profoundly, the knowledge they tirelessly gathered, the astronomical charts from Timbuktu, the medical texts from Persia, the nautical maps of the Atlantic, and the technological secrets from China, acted as a lifeline of learning, pumping vital information into the heart of a Europe that was slowly emerging from its intellectual isolation. They were the great synthesizers, the quiet intermediaries who connected disparate civilizations and facilitated a silent exchange of ideas that would eventually help fuel the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery. The world we live in, a world of interconnected trade, cultural exchange, and shared knowledge, stands on foundations that these warrior monks helped to pour. As we close this chapter on their forgotten journeys, it's worth reflecting on how these hidden threads of history bind us all together. The coffee you might drink in the morning, the spices that flavor your food, the maps that defined our continents, and even the very ideas that underpin our modern world were all touched in some small way by the ambition of these men in white mantles. Their story challenges the simplistic narratives of a clash of civilizations and instead offers a more nuanced vision of the past, one built on pragmatism, curiosity, and an unrelenting drive to reach beyond the known horizon. We want to hear from you. Which of these 25 missions astonished you the most? Was it the perilous trek to the Mongol court at Karakoram, the clandestine acquisition of coffee in Yemen, or the audacious possibility that they reached the Amazon long before Columbus? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you've enjoyed this deep dive into the secrets of the past, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration into history's greatest mysteries.